This meeting open. That's the sound of my hammer. Mr. Hayward, do we have an open quorum? That's the sound. But let me start. Ms. Batchelor, Vice President Batchelor, would you like to say something about the social studies testimony and other parts of your leadership report?
Sure, just very briefly. I represented, I want to thank all the colleagues for your feedback. I represented the board last week before the council during a hearing on Councilmember McDuffie's bill around establishing a African American and civics and cultural history course through DCPS and making it a graduation requirement. And I know all of us as an institution had some concerns, not about the premise, but about the process, and so was able to go to the council last week and walk through some of that with members of the council, just to talk about what we thought our role should be in that process, especially around establishing graduation requirements and also updating the council on our really important work that's already begun around reviewing and revising our social studies standards. Mr. Hayworth has prepared a response to some of the questions that were left on the table last week that will also be advancing to the council. But just wanted to thank all of you and let everybody know that that's an ongoing conversation with the council, to hope, just in the hopes that they get a better context of the work we're doing right now. But in addition to that, as they move forward with, I know what is their concern about making sure that our standards and our curriculum are culturally responsive and inclusive and affirming for all of our students, that we be a partner in that work. So just wanted to thank everybody for that.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter, do you want to say anything about that as well as the social studies chair? And I know you also testified.
Thank you very much, President Wattenberg. Yeah, I really appreciated Vice President Batchelor's testimony. I thought he did a fantastic job representing the board and explaining our work and how it relates to what the council is considering with the legislation on African American history and cultural studies. I will say, though, I'd also like to note that the folks who testified in favor of the legislation brought up a number of really thoughtful points that I hope our state or social studies standards advisory committee will be able to consider. Because in particular, listening to Dr. Carr from Howard, the way in which he described the work that was done with Philadelphia Public Schools, I think has some really important insights for how we approach our work with revising the standards. So I thought it was great, and I really thank Mr. Batchelor for his testimony to the council on our behalf.
Thank you. And the one thing I would just say to anybody who's listening is one of the issues, it's not the only one, typically in states and in school districts, you have a school board type of entity, maybe along with the state education agency, that's making decisions about what sort of the high school graduation requirements will look like, what a curriculum will look like. And if different ideas are coming in from lots of places and not being sort of collated with the others, we end up with a problem. And so it's important to be able to bring in all of those different ideas and take them seriously and figure out either how to put them into the existing set of courses, the existing set of standards, or do something else. But ideally, it is centered in one place. And so we look forward to working with all of our partners on that and to seeing all of that come together in the social studies standards that the state board is now working on. Okay, the one thing I want to just bring everybody's attention to is you've been getting these, the state board staff has been putting together some one-page, they're called one-pagers, or not necessarily one page, but the idea is to have simple statements, simple briefs, issue briefs, I would say, about specific issues, and they've been doing a set around reopening. And the idea is that these could sort of digest a lot of what we've been hearing in testimony, put them in a format where they're very accessible to the press, they're very accessible to us, they're very distributable, we can use them with the council and so on. So I encourage people to take a look at the ones that have come out, to be aware of them, use them as you can, and get feedback to me, get feedback to John Paul and the staff, so we can think about how to make this a way of putting out information that really works for people. And many thanks to the staff for their efforts in putting this together. All right, with that, Mr. Hayworth, Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Madam President. So I have a couple of things that I want to note. First of all, we had a fantastic swearing-in ceremony for our new student representative, Shayla Dell, on Monday, and thank you for everyone who tuned in for that. We will have a second swearing-in ceremony on Friday for Alex to swear him in for his second term, which is also a great opportunity. The virtual platform has actually allowed us to do a little bit more than what we've done in the past, and that is meaning what I mean is we've also provided an opportunity for the student representatives themselves to actually make comments or do a little speech similar to the one that members do during their swearing ceremony. And I really like that format and the ability of the virtual platform to be able to do that and then to distribute that information out to members of the public. So that's a really great opportunity for them. I also want to note for one other thing, that we have 2 outstanding fellows for which this will be their last public meeting with the state board. Simone Wright and Sandra from Mansour, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later on climate. This is their last meeting with us. We do have additional fellows that will be joining us soon at the end of the month, but I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge their amazing work at the state board. We have been very grateful, or we are very grateful for all of their work, but we have had a lot of really great input from them. So I just wanted to note that. Ruth, did you have something to say you wanted to say?
I'm just trying to say there's feedback and trying to get somebody to take care of feedback. Maybe it's me, but so we can hear what you're saying.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm going to try by muting everyone and see if it works. If there's still feedback, I'll try it again on my end in a second. But I think that may have fixed the problem. Great. I'm seeing some thumbs up at least. So anyway, so I wanted to acknowledge that. So if everyone can just join me in a really quick, ASL round of applause for our amazing fellows, that would be really helpful. They've done some really amazing work, and so thank you very much for all of that. I also want to note that we have had, as we move into our next conversation on the budget, that there has been some additional things that are coming out. So I want to stop there for a moment before I move into the conversation about the budget to ask if anybody has any questions related to the admin functions or anything like that that is outstanding that I haven't answered yet. Great, seeing none. Madam President, is it all right if I just go ahead and move into the budget conversation? Thumbs up. Awesome. Okay, so as we've gone through a couple times in the past, our budget process is very challenging in terms of trying to determine how we're going to spend money over a year and a half in advance. That is one of the things that we have been challenged, and this is how government works, right? This is not just us. This is also federal agencies and other states are doing the same sort of process, but it is challenging. And so I want to note that I really appreciate all of the input that we've been getting from board members over the last couple of years about how our budget works, how we can do a better job of serving the district's residents. And I think the budget that we submitted in FY21 originally was a really great reflection of those conversations. So I'm going to try to share my screen with the budget proposal. So give me 1 second. Let me see if I can pull it up. Okay. So I think you can probably see this, but it's really, really small. So I'm going to make it bigger. We can all see it a little bit bigger. And if I get a thumbs up from folks that you can see what I'm looking at. Fantastic. That's even better. So this is the proposed budget, and we're going to focus today only on the sections related to the state board, not on the ombudsman or student advocate. And that's because the Office of the Ombudsman and Student Advocate do have independent budget authority. So they are included in our budget, and we can discuss with them suggestions, but they control their own budget. So, but it's important to have that context of what we're talking about. So, what the proposal is, and what I've talked to you all about before, is that the FY 2022 budget is almost identical to what we proposed in FY 2021. And the reason being for that is that, one, it was a really good budget, and I'm pretty proud of the FY 21 budget it was. But the second part is that we are still in a pandemic, and we are still in the potential of having reduced revenues in the district for the next couple of years, and we need to be conscious of what that's going to look like. And so, what I understand is that the CFO's office will be issuing a revised or an anticipated. Sorry, I'm seeing that feedback is back, so give me 1 second. Let me see if I can try to control for that. I'm not sure if it's gone, but hopefully it is. So the CFO's office is going to be issuing a revised revenue statement, I think maybe tomorrow or the next day, and then another one maybe in the end of September. That will likely show that that in FY21, which is the fiscal year that starts on October 1st, the district will be seeing reduced revenues. And so we should be careful about how this is all going to work and what exactly we're talking about in order to create the best budget possible. So this budget that is proposed here in the FY22, you'll see what I said was that we're keeping it level. Yet almost everything is increased a little bit, and that's some of that is because in the personnel services, and that's due to the cost of living increases that we've been continually giving to our staff, which I think is important to make sure that the staff receive at least cost of living increases, because cost of living does go up, and to also recognize that the potential for merit increases will be there in FY 2022, which I think is also important. The other thing that I want to note here is that this is one of the things that I believe Representative Jacobson brought up before, but it's something that's been really important to us over a number of years, is that we do pay our fellows. Our fellows have earned at a minimum of $15 per hour at the state board for the last 3 or 4 years. And we thought that was very important to make sure that they are paid a salary rather than just doing it for free or for for the experience, because they are working and they should be compensated for what they're doing. But the district's living wage law has now increased our district's minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I think it's important for us to keep pace with that we are paying our fellows more than just the minimum wage for the city. And so what I'm suggesting here in this budget is that we increase our fellow pay by $2 an hour, and that increase would actually potentially go into effect in FY21 rather than FY22. But this proposal continues that new funding through FY 2022. And then if we go down to the NPS section, which is the program section of our budget, what this means is that these changes have not changed largely from what we proposed in FY 2021. And sorry, so Ruth asked a really good question related to at the top why this is being compared to the mayor's budget versus the proposed, and that's because that's what I had at the time, and so it was the most reflective of what was included in the FY21 budget. So these budget numbers should reflect what was passed by council, because those didn't change in our budget, and so I could change this to, past budget, and I will by the end of by September. So thanks for pointing that out, Ruth. That's actually really important to note. So if we, like I said, if we move down to non-personnel services, you'll notice that most of our funding is included here in this line 0408 professional services and fees. That's where we spend most of our money, because there's two things that we spend money on, or large purchases, right? Those are either through our purchase card, which is our government credit card that we use to book travel, to buy supplies, to do everything. And then the second piece would be through our contracts, whether that's for a research contract with individual or organizations that help us do research, or it's for our payments of for other large contracts. So anything over a certain dollar amount has to be dealt with in a different way in the procurement process, but they're both contained in our budget in this 0408 line. So you'll see this 240 includes the funding that we had requested for research, which was the $130,000 that we got in this fiscal year, or sorry, last fiscal year, and then it was carried through for the FY21 fiscal year. Again, remember that we also will be submitting, or can submit, enhancement requests, which is additional money for projects and programs and additional staff members. That is not contained within this budget. This budget is all things being equal, we're going to remain the same. So if we want something extra, we have to add that through the enhancement process generally. So that's where this is coming from. And you also see that I've also put up, again, the full amount for payment of NASB dues, because that is a really important thing for us to contain within our budget. And I'm very, I want to note again for those who haven't yet taken advantage of the fantastic resources that NASB provides, but NASB's research programs have been very helpful to all of us. Darren has also joined a new NASB committee that's been set up, and I think that work is going to be, I believe it's called the Whole Child Discussion Group, I think. But that work has already been shared with the members of the Well-Rounded Education Committee, and I think there's going to be some really great synergies between that work there. So I want to make sure that that is contained within our budget as well. So not so that I talk ad nauseum at you all forever, but does anyone have any questions specific to this budget?
The amount that we were budgeted for 2021, or for 1920 for travel,
yep,
because of the pandemic, does that carry over, or do we lose it completely?
So no dollars in the state board's budget carry over for anything. So that money is gone. For the current budget that we're in, we have already, remember, voted to give back some of that money to pay for COVID expenses in the mayor's budget. And so that travel funding has already been eliminated for the FY20 budget. Well, that makes budget so much easier. I appreciate that. So I do want to note, though, I will be working in August to develop with the leadership team on developing some proposals for enhancement requests. If you have any suggestions about things that you think would be different from the enhancements that we submitted in FY21, certainly let me know. And I'll send that list out to members so you have that at the top of your email as well to review those and see if there's any tweaks or suggestions that you think we should make. You'll remember that one of the things that we specifically asked for were additional staff people, including one for the work to have someone devoted on the staff for standards research, which would be very helpful right now for the social studies work, but also for the future work that we have, because we do have a number of other standards that are, let's say, aging gracefully right now. And so we need to make sure that we have someone on staff for that, which would be fantastic. So. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you all very much.
Okay, we'll get this. Anyway, we're now ready to go to departing fellow Sandra's presentation about, I think, indicators around climate that could be used in a digital world that will give us some fodder for thinking about various things as we go forward. Is that a fair way to explain what your
Yeah.
narrative was? Okay, very good.
That sounds good. And I can put a link to the document in the chat, I believe. Or I can share my screen if that's still needed, but it's not letting me put this link in here. Do people need me to share my screen? It's not allowing me to send the link. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. That might make a difference. Let's see. There we go. Okay, that should pull it up for everybody. Okay, so as President Wattenberg said, I'm going to be presenting some information about adapting school climate measures for distance learning. So for the past several months, I've been looking at school climate for the research committee. I wanted at that time to see how we could incorporate school climate into our accountability framework, if that was something that was wanted or needed. And just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know or watching online, school climate encompasses the learning environment in schools. So it has to do with things like how students feel in their schools, how supported they feel, how much they feel like they belong, how much they trust the adult relationships in school, things like that. And so school climate plays a really crucial role in how students can learn and thrive in schools. And in fact, a positive school climate actually can lead to better academic outcomes, test scores, student engagement, and things like that. And I wrote a recent blog post compiling some of that research also, which you can read if you like. And then when COVID-19 happened, we were thinking, okay, well, how do we bring school climate measures into a distance learning environment? If it's so important, it's going to be something we need to continue with. And in doing this research, I think it brought up a lot of important equity considerations. So we can't really talk about school climate leading to great student academic outcomes if we're not supporting and giving access to all those students equally. So I know that the state board is working on an equity statement right now, and I feel like the information is pretty timely. So on the front page, you'll see the 7 domains that I chose, and I chose them not from any one list, but just sort of as a combination of everything I've seen from the research. And if you scroll to the chart, I'll just give you an overview of what it contains. Each domain is listed in the first column with a definition underneath it. There are traditional examples of those indicators, some general examples that could be used for distance learning in the third column. And then the fourth column is really specific to the DC context, and it features either things that DC could do or things that some education agencies in DC are already doing or have already made some progress on. And it includes, again, some research and some of my own recommendations based on everything I've read. So we'll start with the first domain, physical and emotional safety, on page 2. And it's close to what it sounds like. It has to do with how students feel, if they feel safe in case of emergencies or day-to-day life, how they feel emotionally, and how much they feel adults are in control of the school. And these are just examples. They're not an exhaustive. So I think one big way that we can adapt this for distance learning would be to focus on preventing online bullying. And that could mean something like establishing a code of conduct with password and chat box protections and guidelines around recording or taking screenshots during virtual learning. So you'll see in the last column that, as far as I can tell, DCPS and charter school LEAs in the district haven't established any codes of conduct. But if you go to the end of the document at Appendix A, I've featured a couple codes of conduct from schools around the country that could serve as useful starting points. And the things that they seem to have in common are internet usage policies, how students should interact with educators and other users, bullying and harassment policies, processes for disciplinary action, and parent-guardian responsibility. Moving on to the second domain, that's physical environment, also on page 2. And in a traditional setting, this really has to do with cleanliness, order, appearance of school facilities, and if a school has adequate resources and materials, including textbooks, technology devices, art supplies, etc. And because it tackles that digital divide that we've been talking about during the pandemic, that's why that's included in this domain and not in the diversity, equity, inclusion domain. That's coming up. So like I said, the digital divide is a really big point to focus on for distance learning. And in the fourth column, you can see that over the summer, DCPS did set up these things called learning hubs, where they tried to partner with the Department of Parks and Recreation to give students learning spaces around the city and connect students with community centers, spaces, technology, books, etc. So that is a pretty good model to continue to follow if services like that were needed in terms of physical environment. And you can see that in Appendix B, some of the learning hubs that were offered. And in this area, there were some holes in the research still about physical environment, particularly around the point where educators want teachers to talk to students about setting up a study space, like a quiet place where they can study and have access to resources. But there wasn't much out there about, okay, well, what if my student doesn't have that space? You know, what creative ways can teachers, what are some creative suggestions that teachers can make to help their students? I think that there's still a little bit, there's a need there to sort of support students in their physical environment right now. So the third domain is diversity, equity, inclusion on page 3. And this goes from every level. So for students, that might include supporting students of different backgrounds and abilities. For students, this might be how well they get along with other students. And for schools overall, this might be how welcoming they are to families and students of different backgrounds. So obviously, this is a huge consideration for distance learning. Some useful ways to deal with it would include being flexible, teachers being flexible around students' varying needs to technology, health and financial concerns, greater concerns for families such as food insecurity, COVID testing, and access to medical help, and also providing needed information, especially online, in community languages. So in the fourth column, I've noted that DCPS has made a lot of progress on these things. For example, there were virtual town halls held very recently in Spanish and Amharic. There's grocery distribution sites set up at schools, which should continue as long as the pandemic continues. And the new reopen site, dcpsreopenstrong.com, you can translate it into 5 other languages. The 6th language under the DC Language Access Act is Korean, and I suggested that that be also added as an option. And I wanted to point out the footnote at the bottom of that page had some really great suggestions for teachers, specifically with supporting student learning for vulnerable groups such as refugee students or English language learners. There are a lot of great ideas in there. I'm going to skip over the relationships domain, but it should be noted that I'm available to answer any questions after this about anything in the document, any of the domains and any of the recommendations. So moving on to the supportive learning, that's on page 5. This includes traditionally, from the teacher's perspective, supportive learning practices such as giving encouragement and constructive feedback, allowing varied opportunities for students to demonstrate their knowledge and skills, supporting student risk-taking and independent thinking, etc., things like that. This is also very crucial during the pandemic, and there are some useful concepts listed in the 3rd column, such as allowing students to self-select how much independent learning and the challenges that they want to do, weaving in current events into lesson plans, and teachers adapting the lessons where necessary for virtual learning. And another example at the very bottom of that 3rd column is providing virtual office hours and making those being well communicated and accessible to students and families. So DCPS has actually worked in virtual office hours for its pre-K 3 and 4, but I wanted to suggest that it incorporates that into the schedules for all of its grades. You can see in Appendix D some of the schedule snapshots that they released and where those could be fit in. I also wanted to call your attention to Aussie's Continuous Education Resource Guide. It's a pretty comprehensive list where they've grouped resources for students and families by topic. And so there's a lot of things that you might be able to find that is helpful for supporting learning at home. And then lastly, if you're at all interested, there is a cool video footnoted at the bottom where a DCPS high school chemistry teacher turned his kitchen into a science lab. And I thought that was a fantastic way of showing a teacher creatively adapting, for the learning environment. So he had a tripod and a camera taking, streaming him and everything. It was great. I'm going to skip over sense of community and end with continuous improvement, which is on page 8. So traditionally, a big way to measure school climate and the domains that are listed would be through a school climate survey, which is something I've presented to the research committee about before. Schools, there's already some school climate surveys that have pivoted to be distance learning surveys. Specifically, Panorama has provided some. And so I recommend that since DCPS is administering the Panorama survey already, it might want to consider using its distance learning surveys. And if you go to Appendix G on page 17, you can see the 3 survey instruments that you can pick from there. At the July 30th press conference, the Deputy Mayor of Education, Kine, emphasized that school will be in session during distance learning and attendance will be taken seriously. And that gets at some of the other school climate measures like chronic absenteeism and what is being done to be able to use that as a measure during distance learning. And at our June working session, Aussie said that they are working on emergency legislation around attendance and what that might look like for how we can use chronic absenteeism. So I do think there's some progress there. There are other indicators that we traditionally use, such as access to a well-rounded education, college and career readiness, and 9th grade on-track indicators where students earn at least 5 full-year course credits in 9th grade. And some of those you can continue to use. So you'll be able to still measure college and career readiness through course enrollments, for example. But I did want to mention that while right now we can still use a 4-year graduation rate, if there is some sort of change to how things are being tested because of the pandemic, those metrics will need to be adapted. So we know that schools had the option to waive out of standardized testing at the end of the school year. And so there's a debate about if that will be allowed again this school year. But if those things change, I think some of those measures are going to need to change to continue to measure school climate under continuous improvement. So that wraps up the chart. I wanted to let you all go through the appendices on your own if you like, and just see if you have any questions that maybe I can help you with the remaining time.
Hi, Ruth. Okay, give me 1 second. Go ahead, Ruth.
So before we get into general questions, actually, the first thing I want to say is the deputy mayor is coming at what time, John Paul?
5:45.
5:45. So we have 10 minutes. So before we open this up to questions, I just wanted to ask Sandra, but also John Paul, your own sense of how you expect to have this used. Is this information for us and we should take what we take? Is it something that you see us promoting as sort of these are policy proposals, recommendations from the board that we should sort of look at and provide feedback on?
I guess I could go first. I was envisioning this as sort of a starting point, but also a snapshot in time of what progress has been made and what still needs to be made. I think there are some really specific examples where these could be things that you all advocate for if you feel like they're appropriate. But I also think, some of the footnotes, some of the ideas could also be really useful for teachers specifically. Like they're not necessarily all policy ideas, but some of them are just places to point parents, teachers, and families with specific problems that they might have.
Fraser, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. I have 2 questions. You had a thing about DCPS reopen.
Yeah, the website.
Right, the website, okay. One of the biggest problems we have right now is people's access to anything that has to do with the website. Are those things in different languages? How are they going to be made available to families for whom English is a second language? That's my first question. And the second question is almost the same thing. You mentioned Aussie's Guide.
Mhm.
Is that in different languages too?
I don't think it's in different languages. It's
Okay, that's
hyperlinked, and I think it's only in English.
okay. That's ridiculous. We need to make sure that everything that's put out by the school systems are in languages that our students speak or their families speak. So I just want to throw that out. Thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Sutter?
Thank you so much for this, Sandra. It's really helpful. And I really appreciate, especially the way you called out opportunities for things that have been done in particular schools or to date could be continued. I especially am noting that physical environment piece, because your point about there's lots of good tips around how to create a safe and consistent learning environment at home, if that's possible. But when it's not possible, I think this note you have about the learning hubs is a really powerful one, and one that I actually have teed up to ask Deputy Mayor Kine about how we can extend that opportunity into the school year. So thank you so much for this. This is really comprehensive and very easy to make sense of. The examples at the end are terrific. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Mr. Parker?
I will echo my appreciation. This is really helpful and great. I have a question around the supports that you mentioned DCPS has established. It seems like you were speaking in the PK grades that they are having like individual check-ins with parents and presumably students. But
Right.
do you know if those types of check-ins are happening for other groups of students, namely, for instance, students with disabilities or other students that may need additional supports where there are these scheduled one-on-one check-ins? And if not, are there any examples that come to mind where that may be beneficial?
Yeah, so I didn't dive too deeply into specific student groups, but I think one-on-one interactions and sort of step-by-step learning has come up as an important consideration for special education students, including in the brief that Darren sent out today. I noticed that there were calls for that sort of thing. So I think that if they're going to be useful for students in general, they're probably going to be even more useful for students that need additional support. I don't have other insight into when it could be useful, but something I could point out for you is that IDEA PCS is noted in the fourth column under supportive learning practices, and they're doing two cool things that we noticed. They are making teachers designate 1 to 4 p.m. for student check-ins, so they're sort of building in office hours for their students. And they are going to be doing weekly virtual town hall sessions for families to help deliver coursework, which I thought I hadn't heard anybody else talk about supports for families in delivering teaching.
No, I love that. I know we're short on time. I would just say there seems to be, and rightfully so, a big concern around students not receiving their due services. And so I see these check-ins or these office hours as a way that families could check in with teachers just to make sure students are getting their services. And there were some grumblings that there may be like some personalized learning plans in the works for DCPS students that have IEPs. I haven't heard more about that, but that's really helpful. And appreciate all your work that went into creating this.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Sullivan?
Can you guys hear me? Thank you so much for all your great work. I have two questions. One about learning hubs, and then the other is about the daily attendance. For the learning hubs, in this past the end of the last school year, were meals and technological assistance provided to the students when they were there and doing their work? Do you know?
I don't know if food was related, but I think technology was given insofar as it had to do with the activity at that learning hub. So from what I understand, some had to do with sports or swimming or things like that where it wouldn't be needed. But I think in other cases, if it was more academic, it would have been provided.
Okay, and then the other question about the daily attendance is just to be sure to end the last school year, that wasn't required for the virtual learning, right? Schools didn't have to check up every day to make sure that the students were attending, or
I'm not sure about that requirement.
I guess I'll ask later.
I believe that is true, that the attendance regulations were waived for the remainder of the school year through legislation at the council through the Emergency Act. I believe that is true, Alex. I don't see other hands. Emily, Marcus, Ashley, do you have questions?
Not right now. Thank you so much, Sandra.
Great. Ashley, you're on mute. Ashley, you're on mute.
No questions at this time, but Sandra, thank you for your presentation. I really do appreciate it. It was informative and I think much needed in the work that we're doing, especially with what's going on with the pandemic. Thank you.
Actually, can I just quickly ask a question? Is that allowed?
Sure, go ahead, Emily.
I was just wondering if you knew more about attendance at the learning hubs in terms of numbers, like were they well attended? I wasn't able to see your presentation or what you sent, so it may have been on there. If it is, then you don't have to answer.
Oh, no, it's not. It's a screenshot of what's available for people to pick from. But no, I don't know the numbers, but I don't mind looking into that and maybe sending an update later in the week.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Are there additional questions? Seeing none.
Sorry, you went on mute at the end there.
So thank you very much, Sandra.
Thank you all.
And if we don't see you again, which I guess we won't, it's been great having you. Thank you. And thanks for all the help at the research committee.
Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
And I see the deputy mayor is here. What timing? Wow. Thank you so much for being with us today. I think our plan is to let you start with, 5-10 minutes, and then we'll all chip in some questions. I know we have a lot. In introducing you, let me just say thank you so much for what you've been doing. I know this is just a kind of a ridiculous time to be alive and trying to make anything work well. So we all really have a lot of sympathy for that and really appreciate it. And I will also say, insofar as you had something to do with it, and I'm sure you did, I think most people on this board were very happy to see that the initial physical opening was delayed, because everything that we've been hearing was really going to be very problematic. So thank you for that. And with that, on behalf of the board, we welcome you here and open it up to you to start.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks to all of you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure interacting with several of you over the past couple months, but also feeling like we really are all in this together. I don't have a formal presentation, but there were a few topics I thought it'd be worth just touching on over the course of a few minutes. And then, of course, I'll look forward to our discussion. I want to start by just stating the obvious, which is, I think despite the language that we are developing around virtual learning, and despite the extraordinary effort our city is going to, I think what we are all in the throes of is a real crisis of generational proportions. And I think the conversation that we have tonight and the work that we do over the coming months and years is going to be around trying to mitigate the worst of this crisis and really doing our collective best to ensure that our young people, our children, our youth are back on a path to the kinds of success that we all aspire for them. So the few topics I wanted to talk about, I think, are relevant for reopening, which I hope is appropriate. The first is access. And I know many of you have spoken very publicly and certainly spoken with me about the critical nature of ensuring everyone's got internet and a device. And, we are spending and have transferred just under $4 million to Octo. Its plan is to effectively backstop the cable bills the kind of hardwired broadband cable bills of families, public school families who need that. And they are working extremely hard to figure out how to identify those families and roll it out. We actually believe we're going to get to most families that way that need it. So we're extremely enthusiastic about that. That approach is less expensive than providing hotspots, which is the reason that we are doing it, because we know we can actually get to more families that way. DCPS has budgeted, as you probably know, for 40% of its families to get devices. They have their survey that's been running. The numbers are coming in just above 40%. So we've got a little bit of work to do there to confirm the data from the surveys, but to make sure that we have enough devices to make sure that all families that need them get them. And I'm sure we will get there because we've budgeted, I think a lot. The numbers are just off. But in general, I think we're in the right direction there. The Charter School Board has set the clear expectation for all charter LEAs that they are responsible for internet access and devices for every one of their students. We've included this question in the continuous education plans that Aussie and the Charter School Board are collecting that are due tomorrow to understand how schools are going to do this. And then secondly, we've released another survey to families to help us understand what their needs are. So we've got a lot of activity on access, and I'm convinced that we will land up in the fall in an unprecedented place in the city where every family that needs internet and a device will have it, which is exciting. I think the second topic is connection. One of the hugest concerns that many of us feel, and I've talked to a couple of you about this already, but when you're in a virtual posture, you lose one of the most essential elements for so many young people in schools, which is connection to an adult, to a caring adult. And we know even when we're in person, we don't get 100% of the way there, but we do a decent job of establishing those connections. And so we are this fall, as you know, in the process of the basic process of ensuring all schools are taking attendance. So Aussie's developed the policy. We work with the data leads across the LEAs. That way we'll be able to track attendance. We'll be able to track chronic absenteeism, which is going to mean something, I think, a little bit different, but that's, 10%. But we'll understand which specific students are disconnecting or disengaging or not engaging in a way that we were not able to do in the spring. Then we will be able to follow up with them. And we're also talking about doing a student survey, because it's the students themselves that can help us understand what are their feelings of connection. So there's both the actions of attendance and of consistent non-attendance, but then also how are the students understanding their own connections to schools and their connections with adults in the schools that we think is so important for their success. So we'll follow up on that. The third area that I wanted to touch on, again, that many of you have raised, is mental health. DBH is actually going to be expanding into cohort 3 schools with new school-based clinicians. So we are going to get to a lot more schools this year than we have in the past, which I think is very good. We are providing supplemental funding so that DBH can continue to support the existing community-based organizations that work with the clinicians in the schools to make sure that that system is stabilized, even though their Medicaid reimbursements are going down. And DBH has been working very hard to develop telemedicine, kind of telehealth capabilities so that the clinicians can engage with families. And one thing that they have shared with me is many of their clinicians who work in the community-based organizations are actually working in the field. So these are not all clinicians who are sitting in offices only interacting with people on computers. They are actually clinicians who are out in the community trying to provide services to families that don't have access. And so that is something that they are hoping to be able to pursue consistently for public school families as well come the fall. So we are working on that. I think the fourth area, which has gotten a lot of attention recently, is, I'll call it scheduling and kind of the pedagogical approach. And on the reopening plans that I've seen, certainly on DCPS's plan, which I know you all got a chance to see through the presentation that we made and through your own conversations, but certainly at a number of the charter LEAs, I mean, these plans are in many instances, significant improvements over what we saw in the spring. And that may, that probably should come as no surprise. We did a really, really phenomenal job as a city in the spring. I mean, I'm both humbled and proud of what I observed and also what we heard back from families through our survey. The majority of families around the city were satisfied or very satisfied with their remote learning experiences, which is extraordinary if you think about how quickly the system turned. At the same time, there were a number of gaps and places that we could strengthen, and I think we've certainly done that. So, for example, DCPS, which was packet-based for its elementary schools in the spring, obviously in the fall now is going to have a large component of synchronous and asynchronous independent activities for students in K through 2 and then 3 through 5. So those plans look really strong. And then again, the ones that I've seen across the charter sector, I think also look really good. So I think we're on a really good path for scheduling and pedagogy in the fall. And then I'll conclude, and Fraser, you'll be happy to hear me talk about this, but one of the things that's been, I think, on the top of many of our minds as we've considered the reopening, but which is not getting a lot of airtime, is just, again, not just the centrality of teachers, but the critical importance of supporting teachers in their craft and in their new craft. And many of us have talked for a long time about how this steady improvement we've seen as a public school system is because of our teachers. And I think the success of our virtual learning across all our LEAs is going to be because of our teachers. And we are looking at and thinking about with our LEAs and with our teacher colleagues, what are the ways in which we can continue to support them? For example, there were a few charter schools across the city who participated in a national summer school academy that provided master teachers, local colleagues working with clusters of students. And this particular model involved daily professional development for teachers, daily coaching, and it has gotten rave reviews from those who participated in it. And so we're looking to see what are the ways in which we can offer that kind of coaching as LEAs and then potentially as a city. I mean, Aussie certainly has a very important role to play through its own professional development. But if you think about whether or not we are going to be successful in our virtual learning, it is really going to be, once again, because our extraordinary colleagues in the teaching profession actually step up and lean in these ways and demonstrate that they are exceptional in this virtual posture, which many of them have and will continue to do, and many continue, as we all do, to need to deepen our craft in this new posture. So we're excited to focus on support for teachers. So Ruth, I'll stop there. Those were just some initial reflections in areas I know you all care deeply about, and I'm happy to have the discussion now as you would like to.
Great, thank you very much. John Poe, I think you're there calling on people and keeping time.
Yes, so members will have a single round of 3 minutes each, and if you are interested in having questions, please do use the raise hand feature, which some of you are already doing, so thank you. So let's start with Dr. Sutter.
Thank you, John Paul. Nice to have you here, Deputy Mayor Kine. Really delighted that you mentioned the National Summer School Initiative. I know the Digital Pioneers Academy in Ward 6 was part of it, and I got to observe a lesson. It was great. My questions are around childcare, and not just for our very youngest children, but for all of our working families who, even with remote school, are going to need assistance with supervision for their children. I've heard a lot about middle-class families and upper-middle-class families hiring folks to do this. There are a number of licensed childcare providers in the city that are flexing their models to do sort of nanny share style learning pods and charging tuition, but that is inaccessible to folks who are using vouchers for care. So a couple thoughts that folks have brought to me are around extending the essential worker definition to allow for that to include perhaps teachers in that. Efforts to continue the learning hubs that DPR facilitated over the summer, or some way to extend the subsidy to allow for families to use them. Can you talk about any initiatives the administration has underway to help with these care needs that families have?
Yeah, thank you for that. We've been thinking about this, as you know, for months. And I actually have to honestly say, I don't think there are any clear or great answers to this question right now. And the reason I say that is because we're always stuck in this conundrum where we think the health conditions in the city are not good enough to allow us to reopen schools. At the same time, we're saying we want to provide enhanced childcare, which brings together groups of children with grown-ups. And so we have to be very cautious, and we've got to be very careful in following the DC Health guidelines and following their advice on what actually is safe at what kind of scale. And so what I can say is this is a deeply felt need that we, like you, Jessica, hear from all quarters of the city, and particularly from families who don't have the ability to telework or work from home and need to go back to work for their own incomes and for the good of their families. We have, as you know, piloted the learning hubs this summer. They have actually gone well. And that is something we would look to doing more of that in the fall if it did seem like that was going to be safe and DC Health felt like it was a reasonable approach for us to take. We do know that childcare centers are reopening, as you've mentioned. So I think there's something like north of 100 of them have reopened all across the city. And we have spoken to many of them. We've learned what they're doing, and a lot of them are having good experiences, meaning they're able to manage the inflow, they're able to do the screenings, they're able to keep the group sizes appropriately done, they're able to work with their families to mitigate the risk from people bringing viruses into the centers. And overall, I think it's been a good experience, and they've managed to follow the guidelines, and many of them are retooling to actually provide additional care, as you're saying, to families, even of older children. And so we're watching that to see if there are ways, as you're suggesting, that we can support that. We're certainly looking at the various monies that are potentially available through the federal programs to see what, if anything, actually can be appropriate to utilize for that. In fact, I was in conversations about that, as recently as today. So I think there's some potential there. And then we continue to look for ideas in other quarters as well. I mean, for example, as I mentioned, we've had the learning hubs, we've got the child care facilities, and there are some families that are asking, are they able to get guidance to run their own kinds of co-ops where they would actually share care, not hiring an additional adult to come in, but just to share care. So we're looking to see whether we can potentially do something like that. So I think there are a number of creative solutions possible here. Some of them are expensive and some of them are not. We feel the need, and we're in discussions in an ongoing way with DC Health to see what we can do that isn't reckless, that actually just feels safe and considered given the health conditions and given that they're not good enough for us to reopen schools.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. So I do need to try to keep us to the 3 minutes so everyone has their time, including the answers. So when the thing pops up, you'll have about 30 seconds to complete the response.
Oh, including the answer. I see. Got it.
Mr. Parker.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, for joining. I truly appreciate the sentiment that we're all in this together. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions, and I would appreciate brief responses. The first is connected to what you were just talking about, the safety conditions in the city. Right now, the mayor stopped short of saying all schools should close. And obviously, there are some LEAs that are still planning some hybrid in-person learning. And so what tracking, monitoring, or magic number is there in place that may cause you to lean in to say, actually, all schools do need to close versus LEAs being able to make that determination themselves? And then secondly, in the spirit of tracking student learning, obviously Park was canceled last year. What sense of student learning do we have what conversations around the state of learning last year, as well as this year through distance learning, will we be paying attention to ensure we're keeping a pulse on how much and to what extent students are learning over the course of the year?
Thank you, Zachary. I don't see the clock. I assume I'm not going to be able to answer those questions in my minute and a half or 2 minutes. So let me just try and be very, very brief. On the first question, that's correct. The mayor made very clear in her announcement that she was positioning DCPS in a virtual posture. I have had a number of conversations with private schools and charter LEAs, almost all of whom are actually following suit. And so I do think while the mayor did not determine that there's a legal mandate for all schools to close, including private and charters, I think there's an assumption that they are, in general, following the course of the virus spread and the community spread, and making their own best decisions based on what is their best for their community, while also complying with the Aussie health guidance that's very, very specific. You asked if there's a specific threshold, and I would say that's a question that's better placed for DC Health. So I would propose that they're a better place to do it. I can tell you the 3 metrics we look at for community spread, and if I've got time, I'll come back to that and share those with you. On your second question, which is what do we know about learning, I would say that is a question that we're deeply, deeply concerned about. And you will note in the Aussie continuous education plans that we are asking all schools and all LEAs to tell us what is the formative assessment that they'll be giving over the course of their school year to understand where students are and how they're progressing over the course of the year. Because we as a city have got to develop an understanding of where our students are compared to where they would have been, and very importantly, how they're learning in this virtual posture. So that is a required part of the school plans that we're getting back tomorrow, and we'll be providing feedback to schools based on what we see there. I can also just share anecdotally, and Zachary, I know you're in many, many schools yourself, but everything I hear suggests that schools are eager to understand this for themselves. So I suspect every single school will be doing their work to understand that. We will try to figure out if there's a way we can aggregate that information across the city so that we can collectively understand what it is we're dealing with.
Yeah, no, you did an amazing job staying within the clock. I would just extend the invitation that any way that we as a board can help there, I'm sure we are willing and wanting to do so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Batchelor.
Thanks, Mr. Hayworth, and thank you, Deputy Mayor, for joining us. My question is specifically around digital equity. Obviously, especially on the DCPS side, I think many members of our community are concerned about really a survey for families assessing their need for digital devices being conducted mostly online, but also in an opt-in response-based system, right? It's clearly there lives some inequity even in the way you assess need. So my question would be in the deliberations around how we provide digital equity and prepare our students for at least the first term of distance learning, what were the barriers or what were the considerations around just providing every student with a device? And if those considerations were made, what were the barriers to doing that? And yeah, I think that's my general question.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I appreciate that question. And the, the idea that we are asking families to provide us information on their access through the internet is not lost on us. And I would say when you talk to the folks who are more expert in survey development than me, you could say there are some things that suggest you might get an inflated number and some things that suggest you might get an undercount. And so it's possible speculatively that these things will weigh themselves out. In the meantime, I will share with you that in the spring, what we did is we did a survey, but our primary way of understanding what families needed was not through survey, but was through schools and teachers and families. So DCPS did an assessment at the school level organically about who needed devices and who needed access. And that's what got them to their initial estimation of what they needed to buy in the spring. they used that along with their initial survey results to get, as I shared with you, to the 40%. And now, as I said, they're doing their new survey and the numbers are coming in a little bit higher than that. So I think we'll be able to resolve that, that difference. There was no barrier to, the provision of devices. I mean, in the spring, DCPS felt like it gave out devices to all those families that actually needed it for engagement in their online learning. At that time, you'll recall a number of the schools were using paper packets and so weren't having synchronous video lessons. So that actually went in some way into that count. So obviously for this fall, when everybody is engaged in much more robust synchronous online activities, as well as the use of videos and other online activities, it's clear that the need is much greater. DCPS budgeted for that much greater need. And as I shared, I think we're going to be able to supply the devices, and then both DCPS through its hotspots and Octo through its broadband access, I believe should get us to our goal of ensuring everybody has access that needs it.
No, I appreciate that, Deputy Mayor. In my last few seconds, I'll just say I think even when you're assessing family need, right, there's clearly going to be some distance in, even if you have a device in the house, really what the capability and bandwidth of that device is. Whereas, like, if we're thinking about true equity for all of our students, providing every student with the same device with the same capability to really get that done is most ideal in my mind, and probably in the mind of most folks in my community. So I think as we're thinking about how to do that right in the long term, I think figuring out if it's achievable both with our budgetary constraints and logistically to provide every student with a device, I think would just be the best path forward. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Batchelor. Ms. McClay.
Deputy Kine, it's a pleasure for you to have you here tonight. My question is around testing, and as you know, there were blanket waivers for federal requirements for standardized tests last year. It has been said that will most likely not be the case this year. And I wanted to get your response on what you guys are doing or what you're planning for in regards to ESSA and standardized tests and preparing virtually and or in person.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't have a good answer for you at this point about what we're actually going to do, because we are working hard to try to figure out what our best solution is here. I personally am very supportive of us administering the PARCC exam this year if we're able to. It will not be the same as if we were doing it in a normal year, obviously. And I think we would only do it if we believe that the results would help us understand what our situation is as a city in terms of learning. And that's a way that will be able to guide us to understand what some of our strategy needs to be going forward. And it's a way for us to understand, frankly, what the effects, or it's one of the ways for us to understand what some of the effects of the pandemic are on our public school system. That said, as you can only imagine, and as your question is implying, to do it is extremely complex. If we're still in a virtual posture, and if we're lucky enough, given health conditions, to be in a hybrid position. And so I don't have a good answer as to what we're going to do. We are looking at and planning for all these eventualities. And as I said, my personal hope is that we will be able to proceed in the interest of understanding collectively what our challenges are and what we'll need to consider and focus on for school year 21-22 and going forward. And we're just going to see what's possible given the state of the city at that time and the state of our public schools.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you, and thank you, Deputy Mayor, for being here. I have 4 questions, so I'd appreciate concise responses. My first one is, when you say devices, do you mean cell phones, tablets, and laptops, or just laptops?
Laptops and tablets for younger students, for the pre-K students.
All
And then for learning hubs, I really like the idea of them. What's being done to improve them this coming semester, and maybe establish programs so that meals can be provided as well as technological assistance for families.
So the learning hubs took place in 2 locations. We had them in the libraries and we had them in the rec centers. And those in libraries actually were in places that had computers. So the technology was provided there. In the rec centers, I think we had the tech in some instances, and in some instances, the kids had to bring it in themselves. I think in all instances, food was already provided, but part of the model is safe, comfortable place for students to come and also receive a meal. So we would ensure that that does happen. And then in terms of planning, if I'm remembering your final question for the fall semester, that's still in progress, as I mentioned earlier in response to Jessica's question. We don't know in what form these learning hubs may be able to live based on the health conditions in the city. As I said, I think we've had a good experience with them, and we're getting some good feedback from families. And we hope to be able to continue them in some way, shape, or form based on what we've learned. But we have not made a final decision on that yet.
All right, and then on the issue of virtual learning, the Student Advisory Committee, the State Board of Education published a report on virtual learning. Have you gotten a chance to look at that?
I have not.
All right, well, one of the things that we were talking about was the importance of communication and transparency. And for us, that comes from having a strong structural support. One of the most important things that all the students in the committee agreed upon was having one virtual platform that kids are learning on. So whether it's Microsoft Teams or Google Classroom or whatever, because it cuts down on confusion. Are you all doing anything to try to make sure that all schools are trying to follow that protocol?
All DCPS schools are using Microsoft Teams.
That's great. And then for tutoring, one of the things we were talking about earlier, I think Dr. Sutter brought up, have you all looked into establishing a volunteer tutoring program for high school students, maybe to tutor elementary students, so that there isn't this disparity in wealth, so that only the upper class students get that extra tutoring?
So we actually this summer provided 2 different tutoring opportunities for elementary and high school students through, one was through Teach for America, and the other was through one that I was very excited about and helped to stand up, was through the Summer Youth Employment Program, and that was for older students. So we had effectively college-age students trained in how to be tutors, and then we offered it to older students. So we did do that over the summer, Alex, and we were pretty heartened by the results that we saw there. I am now in conversation with other organizations, including colleges, to see what's going to be possible for this school year in terms of a tutoring core. And I'll add that I'm also deeply, deeply concerned about school year 21-22. And I think all of us, in fact, you all are probably already thinking about that, but all of us need to think about what is the acceleration and surge in learning support, not just through this year, but also once we get back to something that more closely resembles normal, and what can that surge in acceleration look like? And I believe the kind of tutoring, Alex, that you and your colleagues on the student board are talking about will be critical.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, good evening. I have some short questions, and I like short answers, and so we can talk about it. The security is going over to DCPS. Are they going to be using this time between now and whenever schools open up, not virtually, to train the security, whoever the security is?
Yes.
Okay. You said that there's going to be a clinician in every school from the Department of Mental Health?
No, I'm sorry, Fraser, if I misspoke. I said that they are expanding into cohort 3 schools, which would be 47 additional schools. That doesn't get us to all schools. That gets us to 47 more. And I think we're currently in, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's like 130. Somebody else might know. So we'll be in most schools in DC, but not all.
Okay. And what about a nurse in every school?
There's not currently a nurse in every school. The nursing program through Children's Hospital is in it's in, again, many schools and those that have nursing suites, but we don't have a nurse in every school. And there are some schools that share nurses.
Okay, I'm thinking ahead to when schools open up, like let's say it happens in November. What does the first day of school going to look like without a nurse in a school that doesn't have one?
So a nurse is not required to be in a school to help to implement all of the Aussie and DC health protocols for safe and healthy schools in the pandemic. What's required, as you know, are all kinds of social distancing practices, the physical setup, appropriate screening protocols at the front of the building, which you do not need a nurse to be able to do. A nurse is required, or access as a nurse is required when you've got specific health-related questions. And DC Health and Aussie are in the middle of their own preparedness to ensure that schools will have access to a nurse, those that don't have a full-time nurse, to actually answer questions and address the specific concerns that school communities might have that have to be answered right away. And that can be done in a variety of ways.
And the last question has to do with computers. And for every child, I have 5 children. None of them are in school right now. They're all finished. But if I had 5 children in the house, I would need 5 computers for my children to be able to do their work. Is that being looked at as not just households, but individuals in the schools if all the children are of school age? That's my last question.
Yes, one of the questions that DCSBOE is asking families is whether each child has access to their own device or they're shared. And that's some data that the Chancellor shared at the press conference and is available to take a look at. So we do know the answer to that, and that is being taken into account. It came up a lot in the spring amongst a bunch of the LEAs in public schools, that some students were having trouble doing their work because they were sharing devices. And so schools are now working to try to ensure every child has their own.
Thank you.
Dr. Gasoy.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kime. So I am thrilled to hear that you are considering expanding or continuing the Learning Hub. So my question is about when it is safe to open or go to hybrid, is there consideration of looking at that kind of model as a way to expand sort of schools' space, right? So can schools partner with local libraries and DPR, maybe do outdoor space to create smaller little hubs that are safer? So that's one question. And then related to that, would schools be able to be the ones to initiate that or to plan it based on sort of their very local needs? So I'll just ask that first, and then I have another question.
Yes, and thank you. And by the way, nice to see you. That was an extraordinary youth event we were at together, which I'm still thinking a lot about. The Black Swan.
Likewise, yeah.
Was really stunning and important. So in answer to your question, so first of all, I'll take your second part of your question first. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think is so important that we've come to deeply understand is that every school and every school community is actually quite different, both in its physical setup and its sort of staffing considerations and in its sort of family desires and wants. And so, yes, I think the hallmark to any kind of reopening or hybrid, any kind of in-person, is flexibility. It's flexibility clearly within very stringent health protocols, but as you're suggesting, there's lots of ways in which schools can cater to the needs of its own community by, for example, positioning some classes outside, staggering its own staffing so that young people and adults come into even less contact with each other, and so on and so forth. So the flexibility is key. So the answer to that part of your question was yes. And the answer to the first part of your question is also yes, in that if schools find that they can do more if they had more space, you know, we've looked at a few different locations and places and ways of doing that. So within LEAs. All the LEAs are talking about how they can actually make effective use of all of their buildings and not just limiting a school community to the one happens to be in. We have been very open in conversations with DPR and the libraries about those kinds of uses. The one thing I'll say is the constraint we learned quite quickly for any kind of hybrid approach is not space. The constraint is people.
Mm-hmm.
So in no instance when we did any of our modeling, both at the first initial high level, but then also specifically on a school by school basis, in no instance was it the case that we came across a school that would be able to serve more students in small groups if it had additional space. It was always the staffing.
So would they be able to use the staff at those spaces? Possibly. I mean, not use them, but partner with them, obviously.
So I think there the answer is maybe, and I do think the possibility is very real. So you could imagine if we were in a position health-wise in the city where community spread was limited to non-existent, and our metrics were trending down, and we were able to reopen in some way, schools could absolutely partner with libraries or partner with rec centers. There are adults in those buildings that are eager to support and help young people and actually already have it as part of their mandate.
Yeah.
So all of that is possible at the individual school level. I see John Paul leaning in. I'll stop.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. President Wattenberg.
Ruth, you're muted.
I'm also going to try to get through two questions, so we'll see. So I'll talk fast and maybe you will. The first is I just want to follow up on what Fraser talked about in terms of the digital devices. I hear what you're saying is that last spring DCPS used its infrastructure to find out how many devices people needed and got them out. And I can tell you on the ground, I don't think there's anybody on this board that would say that's what happened. I don't know what the difficulty is, but there were so many students who did not get devices, and there were so many students certainly where multiple kids didn't get devices. So we heard this in testimony from many people where teachers had to go around and sort of do their own inventory and then tell their principals which students shouldn't get them because the teachers were told to say which needed them less. So it did not work. And I will also just say that it is not credible to me that 60% of DCPS students all have their own devices. It just doesn't make any sense. And I would ask you, I guess this would be my first ask is, can you guys reconsider that and just say every student is going to be issued a device and it will have protections on it. It will be loaded with the DCPS software. It will come with tech support, because when people are using their own devices, they're old, they're incompatible, they break down, nobody can fix them, they're stealing from their parents. It really made a bad situation worse. Your turn.
Thanks for the comments, Ruth.
What?
I said, thank you for the comments. I noticed that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to try to do that. So here's the other one, which is the trust factor. And one of the things, again, we all had all these people come to our meetings, and the level to which the teachers in particular, but then I found it the same with my families, did not trust going back to school. They worried about the HVAC. They worried about lots and lots of things. And they need to have the confidence to go back. If we're going to go back at some point in the fall or the winter, we got to win these people's trust. And I wonder if you guys are talking about that. And part of the trust thing is people felt like they hadn't been engaged, involved, and that was principals and teachers. So any thoughts about how to address that as we go forward?
I think trust and partnership is always critical. And I think we've been extremely fortunate at the level of engagement that we have seen from teachers and principals and many, many stakeholders in the school communities on the reopen task force, which I had the honor of co-chairing, had Liz Davis as a part of it. The WTU went to extraordinary lengths to gather feedback and input, which they provided. We've been in constant conversation with them, with other teacher groups. In the charter sector, school leaders have spent a lot of energy and effort to deeply understand the needs and concerns of their educators, work to develop plans that address those. I personally think part of our challenge is moving beyond uncertainty into laying out and helping people visualize and see and understand what safety actually looks like and will look like. And there are lots of ways I think we can do that. So I think it's not only the critical engagement that you're describing, but I do think it's also the way in which we help everyone from educators to families to the general public understand what safe schools actually means and what it looks like and what are the cleaning protocols and how will people enter and exit. Part of the way we're trying to do that with schools right now is we're helping them understand what the child care center experience has been. We're helping them understand what the DPR campsite experience has been. We're helping them understand what the learning hub experience has been. These are all places that have pulled together safely small groups of young people, and they have lessons learned. So we're sharing those across the board. So I certainly agree that ensuring that there is a strong sense of trust that we are going to be safe at the moment at which we believe it is safe enough to open schools will be very important.
I think it's almost job one. And I will just say from my own personal polling that I did, there was a lot of questions among parents and they listened to teachers. So in closing out, because I think we're out of time, you're out of time, we really appreciate this on behalf of everybody. We really appreciate this. And one of the things I hope you take away from it is all of our great suggestions, of course, but also just a sense that there are things going on the ground that don't necessarily get up to the top. And we like to help you do that and make sure you're getting that feedback. It's not meant negatively, but to make sure you get that feedback. And I know you appreciate it. And that's part of how we want to help you. And we really appreciate your being here.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Have a great evening. Enjoy the cool weather. All right. So people, we now have an opportunity ourselves, insofar as we want. We have some time on the agenda to talk about immediate next steps that we might want to take around reopening. That could mean people that we want to have come talk to us at the fall meeting, could mean surveying that we do, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to open it up, whether other one-pagers we want folks to work on. I just wanted to open up what people think would be helpful. Ms. Sutter.
So I have two things I didn't get to ask the deputy mayor about, and I plan to follow up on, but I want to throw this out to the whole board. One is around the question of food. I understand that USDA is not continuing waivers for food to be allowed to be handed out at any site across the city and allowing students to pick it up at any site across the city. And they are requiring thus that LEAs only distribute food to enrolled students. That's not sensible in the middle of a global pandemic to ask a child to go any farther than they need to for nutrition. But it appears that this is a federal issue and there's advocacy and efforts on it. But I do want to make sure that we are doing what we can to understand the problem as well as we can, and to think about what solutions our city might take to mitigate us saying, well, we can't do anything about it till the feds change the waiver. And instead we take a pragmatic approach, which is hungry children should be fed at the nearest site to their home, like full stop. So that's one thing. The second is, admittedly, I am usually an optimist, but the pandemic is getting to me. And I am concerned about the fact that we may not go back into buildings for a very long time. And so if that very long time, let's say it's a full year, let's say it takes us until March of next year before we're able to credibly and safely return children back to buildings. I wonder what conversations are happening now with, for instance, the WTU to say, how do we provide as much continuity of learning to students as possible? So if we don't see children again in person until March or April, what are we doing to rethink the school calendar and say perhaps schooling should go through some months of the summer and breaks should be staggered and thought of differently? I understand that collective bargaining agreements all need to be considered in that time off, et cetera, but that would seem to be a conversation I hope is happening now. And I don't know that it is. So I want us to be thinking in advance for worst case scenarios and how we provide the best and most continuous learning for our children, even if we need to start working on labor agreements and other pragmatic considerations now. So those are my two thoughts. I'm not sure what particular actions I hope we will take other than raising those questions in conversations with our constituents and thinking about how we advocate to our council members and to the deputy mayor for the most pragmatic approach possible.
And can I say, certainly on the first one, John Paul, it does seem to me that that is something we could really look into and have the goods on and understand and be in a position to talk about at the September meeting, if not before.
Agreed.
The second is a little harder to deal with that way, but we can think about that. Others?
Yeah,
Oh,
I would echo those as being beneficial. I would add revisiting our resolution that we passed unanimously to Aussie that we have yet to have a follow-up on regarding students with disabilities, the ways in which they're being supported during distance learning, and then maybe inviting our superintendent herself to just come and engage on that. There are a lot of other stakeholders in our education space that are focused on students with disabilities. I received an email from the folk at PAVE today, for instance. And so I think we could have a broader conversation around what people are thinking, wanting, concerned about, and then also punting that to the superintendent. And then secondly, we had a discussion around transportation issues and our homeless youth and our students that are in shelters, something that obviously we won't have to worry about transportation given that we are in distance learning. But again, how are these students being engaged? How are they receiving any services that they may need? To Jessica's questions around food access and services, I think that is relevant for them as well. So just throwing that out for some of our more disadvantaged student groups and how we can elevate their plight and shine a light in order to get some resolve would be great.
you know, one thing I would say is John Paul and I talked, and Marcus said talked with the superintendent a little bit about that last week, and there is some expectation that there are going to be stronger plans that will be visible. It's not clear to me that they're going to be on one site and so on, but maybe that is something we could look at for the September working session, is to ask the superintendent to come and, you know, we'd ask for quarterly updates and see if she could do that. And that would be a great way to start the year.
That would be great. And it's also a focus for Aussie, and so it could be a great opportunity to partner.
Yeah.
Can I just build on that?
Yes.
So I think related to the question I was asking about, you know, expanding partnerships, that also poses sort of a question about, you know, who's working with students and whether or not they know sort of what those students' needs are. And so I was actually in conversation with one of the folks who was on the panel for our special education panel. And she was suggesting doing this kind of, you know, actually having like a discussion with Aussie and some of the folks, you know, who we already had, but specifically also the School of Behavioral Health Coordinating Council. They're already doing a lot of, you know, they've been doing a lot of work around creating structures, the tiered structure. And if things are, you know, are not all in school buildings next year, she was suggesting it would be good for the SBOE to weigh in on sort of what are the standards? Are there standards that, you know, could be used by other institutions, by other providers who are meeting with students? So that's just something to consider as well. And then can I just add another thing that's not related to that, which is Shoot. No, I don't remember. Come back to me.
I have a question that I didn't get a chance to ask, and that is how are we going to know what the reading levels are and the math levels are for students when virtual schools begin? And I think that's so important that we find out where the students are, because a lot of the students that are going to be beginning at the beginning of September haven't really been involved with being students since March. I mean, I think that when the chancellor was talking about, well, almost 100% of the students had gone online at some point in time. I mean, that is such a ridiculous number. It's not even funny. And I think we need to find out where I don't know who the person, we need to have somebody come and talk to us. I would, you know how I feel about it, before school starts, to find out what the plan is to put students in cohorts or whatever, to find out where they are as far as learning is concerned. We know that normally students, I always tested my students at the beginning of school to find out what their reading level was, so I knew. But I don't know what's going on as far as everything. When the deputy mayor was talking about the park test, I can't imagine that being, I hope that that's not going to be a gauge for anything. I'm not talking about tracking this at all, Zach. I'm just trying to find out where students are, all right? You know, I taught AP to all the seniors, so I'm not talking about that at all. I just want to know where they are in math and in reading at the beginning of school. It only takes a half an hour to find it out.
I have a question that I don't know the answer to, and maybe others know this, or John Paul does. Am I making feedback?
Yes.
No. Oh, should I stop? My question is, on the continuous learning plans, are they going to be publicly available? Yes, you know that was said.
Yes, that is what we were told. Yes.
Because that would be responsive to what Fraser is asking.
Well, not completely. I think what Frazier is getting at, and to speak for himself, is the actual measure of student learning. So the plan is one thing, the execution, I would imagine, is another.
There. Okay.
I have a question for once the school year starts, where are like teachers or like school leaders, students, where are they going to go with their complaints when like if things aren't going well or if they have legitimate concerns? Like, I guess I'm asking, what can we do as a state board so that there's some way they can reach out to us and we can get a direct like level of engagement to see how and where people are feeling? Because I mean, if this is going to go on and it may go on for the like the rest of the school year, I feel like it's important that we do more as a board to understand where people are at.
So you're not talking just about safety if they open, but the whole range of issues, even if they don't open.
I'm saying like once the school year starts, I'm talking specifically virtual learning, when people have concerns and people like when things aren't going well, like where are the students, teachers, whoever, where are they going to go like to talk about some of these issues or to try to get changes? Because I mean, if students and teachers both feel like there's not a whole lot of communication going on, or if they feel like there's some sort of issue at hand that's not being addressed, where are they gonna, like from a policy level, who are they gonna talk to?
So Ruth, I actually really like Alex's suggestions, and I think that we could do a more research and or further report on distance learning, specifically what's working, what's not, what we are seeing. Obviously, there will be a lot of lags and delays. I know Jessica just sent over 3 links that I haven't had a chance to read, but that is, I think, an area that we could look into, especially because this could happen, not just, virtual learning could happen all throughout the next year and into potentially next year as well. And we could see what other states are doing as well, not just what DC is doing and what's not working, but what other states are doing and potentially doing well. What are some of the pitfalls and what are some of the setbacks that our students could face? And so people know what potentially to look out for.
I think Ashley's right. The other thing too is that because there is a plan, people are, because they're humans, they're relaxing right now. We cannot relax. We got to become much more proactive now to find out what is going on, because the communication has been horrible. No one knows what's going on. They're doing it behind closed doors, kind of thing. And we need to know, because the children are the ones that are going to be suffering if the adults don't do what they're supposed to do. And we can't relax. We got to find out. I asked him about the security because, DCPS is now in charge of security. And I don't know if y'all have been in any buildings. I go into the buildings, a couple of times a week to deliver books. And there's nothing going on in the buildings. I mean, if the buildings opened up at the end of August, they don't look any different than they did at the end of March. And now they have all this stuff that was delivered to some PPE stuff to some schools. They all have these PPEs that won't be used until they open up now. But I don't want anybody to think that you can breathe deeply now, because this pandemic isn't going away. Like Ashley mentioned, it might be 2022 before schools open up. And we have to use whatever the little bit of 1% power that we have as elected officials to make sure that everybody is kept aware of what's going on all the time.
I believe that the Well-Rounded Education Committee has some ideas around this, collecting best ideas in virtual learning. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the time. Why don't we go to that as the next committee report, and just so we can sort of just seamlessly talk about that as part of the committee report, and then continue on this before we move into that other issues that people want to raise on issues, concerns, projects, activities.
Well,
Alex?
Sort of to add on to what I was saying earlier, but I remember now the deputy mayor was talking about how they're going to at some point release like a survey. I don't mean to kind of sound like how is this just now happening, but is like for my school, like it's not that difficult to make a mandatory survey for everyone to complete. So I feel like, maybe like there are things we could explore, like bi-weekly like surveys every student, every teacher has to fill out, and then that gets reported to whoever, but there's some sort of centralized process, and there are people receiving this information, and they're actively doing things to try to make it better. Because my fear is that like students will go on complaining, but no one will be listening to what they're saying, and that their calls for change may just go unheard. So if there can be a constant communication between the policymakers and the students and teachers, I feel that's maybe one of the few ways we can actually make sure that if something bad happens in the first week, it's not continued in the 8th week. So
I second that.
Well taken, Alex. I'm think about what those questions would be, and it may be relevant to what we're going to talk about next, or come in a different place, but just really identify what are the, some digestible, viable number of questions that are the most important that would do that. Anybody else on this before we?
President, I have two
Yes.
things that I want to note before we move on to the discussion about the equity statement and framework, which are one thing that Fraser brought to my attention earlier this week related to the greater enforcement that for immunizations for this year. In the past, it hasn't been as strict as it will be this year, but all students should have their immunizations up to date within 20 days of the first day of school. And that goes for this year just like it would for any other year. And so it's really important for our families to note that these requirements are still in place even through the virtual learning environment. So if you have needs for finding physicians to do healthy child visits and to do immunizations and all that type of thing, there are resources available, and so you can contact your school to help find some of those resources. And the second thing I wanted to note is something that the board has talked about a couple times during this calendar year, is the census. Right now, we did just get an update from U.S. Census that they are going to be stopping the census a month earlier than they had originally said, in order to try to provide the information to the president by the December 31st statutory deadline. So that means we only have 2 more months to make sure that as many folks as possible are counted in the census in DC. Right now, our response rate is about 54%, which is tracking with national averages, but certainly we would like to be a little bit higher than that. So over the coming weeks, you'll see from the state board's account some information about census, how to fill out the census, and those types of things. And I would urge members that if you are sending out newsletters or information, please do mention it to your constituents to fill out the census. You know, maybe it's just the end of your sign-off of conversations. Hey, fill out the census, that type of thing, because we'd certainly like to get higher into like the 66 to 70% response rates, so that we do have an accurate count of the people that are living in the District of Columbia. So thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that. Do you want to move directly into the equity statement? Ruth, you're muted. Give me 1 second. Go ahead.
What I'd like to do with the agreement of the board is actually not go straight to the equity statement, but go to the well-rounded education report, because they're going to talk about, I think, a little bit that's related to what we've just been talking about. So just move into that, and then we can go backwards. And Zach is part of both of them, so I see him saying that's okay.
All right. So Zach's okay. I will just go ahead and say what is in my mind about this and or correct. So the Well-Rounded Education Committee, last we met, we talked about sort of making what we're doing relevant to this moment we're in. And so one of the things that we talked about was having panels of folks who are already doing work in the realm of well-rounded education, and we're working on a definition, but we have been defining it in terms of, you know, making sure that kids that all children have access to, full range of course offerings. So it was really focused sort of on academic, and it could include like civics and real world learning, but, you know, really focused sort of on course offerings. And more recently, and what we'll talk about at our meeting coming up on Friday, is sort of maybe expanding well-rounded, or putting well-rounded education under a larger umbrella of making sure that during distance learning, students or teachers are able to meet the needs of the whole child. And what that means is including SEL and mental health and things like that. So kind of expanding it to include, to be more holistic. And what we're thinking about, how we're thinking about doing this, is to first find out, like do a needs assessment in our respective wards, to find out what families have already experienced in the spring, what they felt worked best and what they feel they need. And backing up, actually, we've talked with Darren about actually mining the surveys that have already been done. So there's lots of organizations that have done surveys already, like PAVE and Empower Ed and Aussie. So we're going to see what's already there, create our own survey, and then have a series of panels focused on topics that are connected with what we find out from those surveys. So for instance, if we find out that families and teachers felt that they really needed more support around making sure that they met the social emotional needs of their students during distance learning, then we could have a panel of practitioners, experts in the field, teachers who have already done this and feel like they have done it well and they are able to sort of share their best practices. And then from that, we are still thinking about like, how would we share that out so that it's a useful product for our constituents. So one thing we talked about was actually making short little videos, video clips of the experts, whether it's like clips from the panels themselves or like interviewing them separately, or creating really short little memos right? So maybe doing both, but really with an emphasis on trying to create something that the direct stakeholders will find useful and accessible. Zach, did I leave anything out?
I think you did a great job. I would just underscore 3 quick things. One is this idea connected to what I believe Ashley was saying, is that we want to highlight what's happening in distance learning, but also be a value add to parents and communities. And so I think there is an orientation of naming the problem or highlighting what's not working. But I think one of the ways that we wanted to orient is elevating things that are working, while still identifying ways that we can improve. The second thing I will underscore is, to Emily's last point, is the panel discussions are probably more beneficial to us and those who are in the weeds of this stuff. I don't know if the average parent or teacher is going to watch a 3-hour meeting to watch a board meeting. And so finding innovative ways to push out that information. And then last and most important part is that this is a proposal. And so obviously we haven't had a conversation as a broad committee, but this came and is connected to the conversation we had last time and us wanting to pivot to just be timely given what everyone has going on. And so for those in the committee, I hope you will bring your ideas. Feel free to tweak and tune. Nothing is set in stone, but I'm really excited for us to move in this direction.
Thank you.
I have a question. I don't want to jump in over anybody else. Does anybody else have a question first? And I understand this is all going to get talked out and this is not the end at all, but is there part of what you're thinking about that responds to what Alex raised about how we get some feedback about what's going on in schools in a timely way such that something can be done about it? Or that's really a separate function?
I mean, yeah, that totally could be it.
Sorry.
It's something that would have to be fleshed out further.
Yeah.
I mean, as we broaden and or limit the scope of really what we are looking at, I mean, for me, I'm thinking about how severely impacted student performance will be with virtual learning, and where we need to go from there when and or if students move into a hybrid or finally move back into in-person learning.
Can I just say something that's a little bit different than it's separate from our committee, but it's related to the learning piece, I think, and that is, families, more than 2, I think several have asked about, in one way or another, whether students could continue learning this year in whatever way whatever format that takes. But could they, especially young kids, maybe take a gap year and make it up in the summers once we're safe? So I just wanted to put that out there as like, we may need to think more outside of the box than we are right now about how to address the fact that kids are going to be in very different places when we exit this, strange experience we're in, right? Like, some kids are going to be doing fine and actually excelling, and others are really going to fall behind. And I think parents are feeling like they just want their kids to be engaged. I mean, not all parents, but I've heard from a lot of parents who just feel like, I want my kid to stay safe, healthy, and engaged. And at some point, I want them to catch up. And so is there a point in the future where we can start planning now to think about what that catch up might look like? Like, is there a time and place where kids can, have an alternative? I don't know what to call it, but we need to make time and space, I think, down the road when we're safe to come together in person. So
I personally don't think that there is, because we have no idea what tomorrow is going to bring. This is all brand new. There's no model for it. There's no script.
Yeah, there's no plan. I'm saying we can be part of making that plan, and I think.
Oh, I agree with that.
I think that's something that we can look at. That was a good point, Emily. And it's actually something that I would, had we had a second round of questions, I would have brought up and asked Deputy Mayor Kine, is thoughts around parental engagement. Obviously, we know parental engagement is directly tied to student and school success. And it's something that our city suffers with, in the educational landscape across all 8 wards. So what is DCPS and the mayor and Aussie thinking of doing around parental engagement, and maybe that is a way in which we can lend assistance on techniques and offerings on parental engagement and what can come from that?
I think one of the things that I have not heard yet, but I think maybe something worthy of consideration in trying to figure out the logistics, and this would go to your point, Emily and Fraser, about we don't know yet, because we don't know when we're going to be back in classrooms. We don't know all of those things. But maybe even the possibility of offering for students that need it, a 13th year, right? So maybe at the end of schooling, you've graduated as a senior, but you still need to catch up with other things. Here's your 13th year, and offering that type of programming in a way that is sponsored by their LEAs or the classrooms that they're in or something like that. But there are going to be a lot of students that are going to need additional help and resources across the country, not only just in DC, but how do we do that in a way that we're planning now for that eventuality once we're back in classrooms, right? And I think that's part of the point, is like, what are things that we never would have potentially considered before, but now need to, because this is a completely new situation.
I'll just chime in on that, John Paul. I think the sort of flip side of that is that the things I've been hearing that prompted my questions to the deputy mayor are that there are some, in addition to families sort of coalescing around informal pods of parents rotating caregiving, more like the co-op style the deputy mayor mentioned, is that there are some actual licensed providers in the city who are expanding their business line, if you will, and saying, we're willing to host a pod of 5 students in your home, or rotating through a series of homes with a dedicated care provider for a tuition bill of $5,000 per pod. And so those children will get care and enrichment on top of facilitated virtual learning. And so we may have some students in deep need of a 13th year, while we may have some students really accelerating their learning. So I think I hope we can be open and prepared to the ideas that as we think about all the possible eventualities, we sort of begin to break open our boxes around education the way Emily phrased at the beginning to say, are there more opportunities to think about mastery-based learning? Are there new opportunities in which we have to think about what school is and looks like so that we acknowledge that some children may have moved ahead while others need additional support and additional time, that we can envision systems of public education that can help all those students get what they need.
And I would just add that I love these connections to equity, and it may be a great segue, but this idea of grade level instruction, I think I saw Jessica's comment earlier. I know DCPS is anchoring around grade level instruction, understanding that many students missed a quarter or more of learning in person this last year. And that's going to be pivotal for all of the reasons that we're talking about. And I think that could be an area where we as a board take a stance. It's not to say that students don't need remediation. Obviously they do, but it's how do you anchor that remediation in grade level content, which may not be intuitive for all educators. In fact, I saw a Facebook post where a teacher was taking issue with the idea that they were expected to teach grade level content. And in fact, they wanted to go back and teach previous grade level content. So I say all that to say that these concerns around students not being prepared or being held back, that connects to what our teachers are grappling with at this moment. And it could be very important for us as a board to highlight why it is so important through an equity lens, but also offer supports and a way forward to make that happen. And I know many charters are doing the same thing. I just know DCPS is anchoring around that approach, which is the right approach.
So before we move on, so are you guys, is that your committee report? Is there anything more you want to say on the committee report? Okay.
That's it.
So as we transit backwards to the equity report, what I want people to think about, because there's a lot of good ideas here. There's a lot of good ideas about what our schools could do and what our parents should do. And the question for me as I listen to it is, how do we do our value add? In other words, how do we make a difference on this? I mean, is it taking a stance? Is it showing model programs? Is it creating a really well curated list of questions that we publicize and put to the deputy mayor or to the superintendent? Do we do surveys? Do we run a hotline? So I just want people to really think about, what can we do? You know, we're in this odd space, as we understand. We have a platform, we have contacts, we know stuff, we hear stuff. How we have a staff, how do we use it best? So just be thinking. And with that, we're going to flip back in the agenda to the equity statement.
Okay, my computer's been lagging all day. So I'm going to stick to the 20 minutes that we have. I am going to paste questions that were submitted previously that I hope we can anchor around for this discussion. It is my understanding that we have 20 minutes. And so what I'm thinking of doing is giving an overview for 5 minutes, talking about the actual statement and framework for 5 minutes, getting feedback, thoughts, reactions, talking about the definitions, getting feedback, thoughts, and reactions, and then talking about the bylaws changes that were proposed and getting feedback and reactions. All right, so thank you for all of your work on this and those of you who have weighed in. Why are we doing this? Obviously, we know the status quo is not working, where less than a third of students in DC, and someone sounds like maybe they're not muted, or maybe that's my computer, apologies, where less than a third of students are proficient in ELA and math, where Black and Brown students lag on all indicators behind their white peers, where low income or at-risk students lag behind their more affluent peers. We know that there is a need for an equity approach. That is why we're doing this. The focus on equity is not new to the state board. In fact, the ESSA task force created an equity statement years ago. And so part of this work is updating that equity statement to make it more central to the board's conversations, but also timely. The equity framework is an attempt to ensure that we center equity in all of our conversations and how we set priorities and how we reflect on the work that the board does. Two separate things. In terms of where we are today and next steps, today we're going to talk about the language of the equity statement and framework. You've already had a chance to review that. We're going to talk about the proposed definitions, get reactions, as well as the bylaw recommendations. The reason for the bylaw recommendations is to make sure that this is not just something we talk about, but that we are committing through our bylaws to monitoring and reflecting on our work. Moving forward, and I think this is important just so you have a clear stance or vision of where we're going after this. Between now and our September working session, I'm going to be asking various board members, and so there are phone calls coming, just so you know, to work on 4 key things. One of which I've already asked John Paul and Alex, our student rep, to kind of take charge of, is how do we engage in thoughtful, ongoing equity conversations, both as a board, a broader state board team with our sister offices, but also our staff. I think John Paul is obviously well positioned to think about that, and Alex has expressed interest, and I'm glad that they have both agreed to do that. So more information will come at our September working session about that. The other 3 areas that I'm needing your help and will ask for you to support is how we will make this framework functional for the ways in which we operate. And there are 3 ways that we're going to think about that. One is, how do we establish priorities as a board? How do we analyze policy both internally as well as externally? And when I say externally, that may be from the council or Aussie. And then the third thing is, how do we reflect on the work that we did over the course of the year, or an annual review? So I will repeat those 3 things that I need your help on. How do we set priorities? How do we analyze policy? How do we reflect on the work that we are doing? The work that is going to be done in those areas is quite simple. We're going to create 5 to 7 questions in each of those columns that connect to our equity statement and framework that we should constantly come back to in a way to make sure that we're keeping our framework and equity focus central to how we establish priorities, how we analyze and propose policy, and how we reflect on our year. I'll give one quick example, and then I'm going to move us forward. So let's say Jessica and Emily raise their hand and say, we're going to work on a guiding questions for how we should analyze and propose policy as a board. Zach wants to propose a resolution. Emily and Jessica would have created those questions. Let's say the board accepts it. What that might look like is that Zach then brings the language of the resolution to a working session like I normally would, but I would have also have thought through the answers to those questions. And as a board, in addition to the substance of the resolution, we would talk about the substance of those questions. How does this connect to our equity framework? How does this advance the performance of severely disadvantaged students, so on and so forth? That is an example of what these questions might get at. It is not to make the work of the board more bureaucratic. The goal is so that we can make clear connections to our equity framework, which in turn will make equity more central to our discussions and our decisions. That is where we are. That is where we're going. Today, again, we're going to just focus on the language of the statement, the framework, the definitions, and the bylaw proposals. So, John Paul, thank you. You have just shared the link to the I'm going to see if I can do this. I believe I am sharing my screen. Is that right? Okay. So the first thing we wanted to do was to visit the substance of our equity statement, and let's focus here. and then we'll go to the equity framework. And we won't spend a ton of time here. I know you've had quite a few opportunities to weigh in here. I would say, for the sake of time and our focus tonight, let's focus on the substance of things versus style. So what if there is a comma missing, or you would prefer it being a colon versus whatever, we can handle that offline. If there is a word change, or you don't like the structure of things or the focus, I would say let's spend our time there. So I won't read this, but just the orientation around the equity statement. This first sentence that I'm highlighting here anchors on an assessment of our reality. Because of institutional racism and inequitable policies, we now have uneven outcomes for a variety of student groups. You will remember that we previously called out Black and Brown and low-income students. We received feedback that that may have been too limiting and may have seemed to exclude other student groups. So now we just named various student groups to keep it general. The second section of the equity statement focuses on what we as a board believe. We believe all children with the right support.
Can I interrupt you 1 second? Can you zoom in a little bit?
Oh, I'm sorry. Now, John Paul, you're asking for a lot. I think I know how to. Let's see if this works. Oh, that works. That works. That works. Is that better?
But we can look at it on our own. I mean, you put the link in there, so that might be better.
But for those in TV land, maybe. This second section focuses on what we as a state board believe, which in large part says we believe all children with the right support can achieve at high levels and become well-rounded individuals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This third section, as proposed right now, discusses the work of the board, what we as a board will do. We will identify priority issues. We will support the work of our sister offices. We will support state level policies, et cetera. This last section focuses on how we will do it, which connects to our equity framework. Those 3 bullets connect to the 3 things called out in our equity framework. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up for a general reaction. You have the guiding questions in our chat box. I would love to have you weigh in, and let's say we will chat here for 3 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next section, if there are comments. So, John Paul, can you remind us what those questions were?
The questions from...
Yeah, I chatted them in the chat box, but they were the guiding questions that we wanted people to reflect on.
The language wording changes?
Yep.
Does the proposed equity framework focus areas reflecting critical levers for the state board?
Right.
Do the suggestions for ways to utilize our equity statement and framework resonate?
Got it. So I guess to simplify this, general reactions and or recommendations for substantive changes to the equity statement as it is now.
I think it looks good.
Okay.
Zachary, I'll chime in and say the same thing and add one more point. I've gotten to work on equity statements with a few clients recently, and I will say that they can be long or short. I know we've had previous conversations around the length of our statement. I like that ours is still concise because the use of bullets, I think, has helped direct that a lot. And I like that it aims to both state why we're about the work, what we mean by the work we're about, and then what we think that work should look like. And to me, that's really helpful in making this an actionable document that others can look to and hold us accountable or question whether we are holding ourselves accountable. So I'm really content with where it's gone, and I appreciate the work it's taken to get here.
Thanks.
And I just want to say the same thing. I think that the fact that nobody has a lot to say reflects that it has come a long way and says what I think people wanted to say. So I'm very happy with it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take that as a second, just because I know time is of the essence. If you want to go back, feel free. So then the next thing is our equity framework. Why do we need an equity statement and a framework? And the general response would be our equity statement is just that. It's a statement. It's a statement of values, beliefs, and ways of being. Our equity framework, hopefully, is something that is something we will work to live up to, and it's how we will function as a board. I shared with several board members that I'm hoping that this equity work, obviously year after year, gets tuned, but that it is something that would become institutional to us as a board and will not fluctuate from year to year, leadership from leadership, but there will be something that defines the state board, that we are grounded in equity, whatever those focus areas it may be as a board. So what you're looking at here are the three components that are named out in our framework. One is focused on academic outcomes, specifically connected to severely disadvantaged student groups. Another way you could think about that is linking that to at-risk student groups. I don't love that term. I know a lot of people take issue with it, so I was careful not to use at-risk. Instead, we say severely disadvantaged. So as a board, as a matter of equity, we will focus on improving academic outcomes for severely disadvantaged student groups. A second thing as a board we will focus on within those things under our purview is advocating for increased representation in DC's educator and administrator workforce, as well as making sure there is ample representation in the internal board's functions. What does that mean? So if we have a panel, we will make sure there is equitable representation of a variety of groups. As a staff, we will make sure there is equitable representation. And I'm, glad that that is something that we were already attuned to anyway, making sure that we had broad representation across various groups. We know, and we have resolutions this year calling attention to the fact that there needs to be greater representation, namely around Black and Brown educator populations in DC schools. And so that is something that this focus area would, again, push us to advocate for. We don't have any control over that, but that is something in our advocacy we would push for. The third focus of this framework is around what we're calling educator and cultural competencies. Again, we don't have authority around the professional learning DC educators and administrators have access to, but we might advocate that they have access to ongoing culturally relevant pedagogy, because research tells us that having culturally responsive instruction in classrooms, schools lend to very healthy school cultures and therefore improved outcomes, namely for marginalized student groups. Likewise, as I mentioned before, as a board, we are wanting to have more equity-based conversations. And so this would focus on that component of our framework. So I'm going to pause there and then ask a similar question. What here resonates as affirming, as well as what substantive changes might we propose to what we currently have in our equity framework?
I have a real problem with the language of the first academic outcomes.
I would second that.
Severely. I don't think that's such a negative. And I know that's not what you mean, because I haven't seen that sentence before. Zach. The DC State Board of Education seeks to improve outcomes for severely disadvantaged student groups. Okay, does that mean we're not working with? I mean, severely disadvantaged is. I'd like to know what the definition of someone who's severely disadvantaged is.
That was my suggestion as well, having a definition for that.
Yeah, I knew you would say that, and that is precisely why if you scroll down to the next page, there are, or 2 pages down, you'll see definitions. a way of thinking about it is at risk. And DC, we talk about at risk student groups. I know there are a lot of people in and around Ward 5, at least, but also across the city that take issue with that term. And so we totally don't have to use severely disadvantaged. But I was also trying to be thoughtful not to use the term at risk because I know it's a trigger for a lot of people.
At risk is actually.
Fraser is trying to talk and is muted.
Oh, I'll just finish my sentence, which is related to what Fraser and Ashley were saying, which is that that strikes me the wrong way too, the severely. But I will also I guess I'm questioning why we would not use at risk. I understand what you're saying, Zach, but it is a category. It actually means something in our system, right? Like it is defined.
Yeah.
And maybe we could, gather input from constituents about changing that. But right now it actually has meaning, whereas severely disadvantaged, I know you said it's you would have to go and read the definition as opposed to at risk, which.
But severely disadvantaged to me is way at the end of a scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I agree with Emily about at risk. I mean, it's the reason we get Title I money. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, go on. I don't mean to interrupt.
No, we can do something with that to make sure that we're talking about students who are deprived of the education that other students have.
Totally.
I don't think I think that we ought to get rid of that severely disadvantaged all over the place.
Yeah, I think it doesn't solve the problem because, I mean, I'm not sure why people are opposed to at risk, but I can guess. And I think it's sort of putting the label on the student as opposed to naming that the reason the student doesn't have what they need is because of the system, right? And so if we're going to change the language, I think we need to address that, then it should actually name that. And I can help to wordsmith that if you want. But again, I sort of feel like we should probably use at risk if that's what we mean. Do we mean the students who are categorized in, our system as?
That is what we mean. That is what we mean.
Then we should probably use it and maybe put a little asterisk. I don't know that's why we used it. And then can I just, while we're in this section, I know at one point we had changed academic outcomes to student learning, and I was just curious why you changed it back.
I don't recall that change, but I will list it. Because before we had academic achievement and growth, and I thought the consensus was to change it to outcomes.
Okay. And so do we mean on tests or do we mean something broader?
To student learn, sorry. Let's see. I think it encompasses all of those things, but I think that's a point of conversation for the board. Outcomes, learning objectives or standards that schools and teachers want students to achieve, as well as the educational, societal, and life effects that result from the students being educated. I don't, that is a general definition, but we would want to get clear what we mean by that. I would argue that it would, of course, include standardized test scores.
It would include it, but not be limited to.
Not,
and I think
no.
It should be connected to how it's defined in our statement, which is broader, right?
Yes. So, for instance, graduation rates would be included in my mind in outcomes.
Right.
Yeah.
Being able to, I think in the statement, well, I can't scroll up here, but, we talk about other skills. I put 21st century skills, and that might need an asterisk too, because I don't know if people necessarily know or have the same ideas about it, but it's about, critical thinking and collaboration and all the things that students need to be able to do, dispositions, and not just, so that would go under learning, right?
Yes, if we make that swap, yes.
Zach, how about improve outcomes for students who are lacking access to high quality instruction and necessary support because of situations beyond their control?
I dig that. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, where's the original thing? I started with improve outcomes.
For students, did you say?
Improve outcomes for students who are lacking access to high quality instruction and necessary support because of situations beyond their control. And I'm not wedded to the end of that, but I think that's what you're saying.
Yes. And one thing I like about that is that you don't put the blame on the student,
Right.
which is and stigmatize them, which is one of the things that I know people take issue with the term at risk. But I think you all also raise a good point that that term is known and defined in our system, so people know what we mean when we say at risk versus something else. So,
Zach, I think
point well taken.
If you check the chat, I think Jessica has another potential solution for that problem that meets both these needs.
I totally can't even see the chat right now.
I can read it to you, Zachary. I'll literally read what I wrote. When I testify or write about our funding category, I make a habit of using, quote, students designated at risk, so as to make clear the label has been applied to students rather than being a state of being of the child.
I like that.
Can I add on to that? Like, I agree with what Dr. Fred is saying. And one thing I know is that when you're talking about people who are experiencing homelessness, that's the correct way you're supposed to word it. Like, you're not supposed to say like homeless people, homeless youth. You're supposed to describe it as people experiencing homelessness, youth experiencing homelessness. So in a way, it's not like that's how they're defined. It's just something they may be going through at the time. So I think that may be a way to sort of recognize the sensitivity that comes along with the word, but also recognize that it's not like you being homeless or you being at risk doesn't define who you are as a person. Instead, it's sort of like you may be categorized this, but it doesn't mean that's what you are.
Totally.
It's a thing that we lack in the English language that other languages have. So Spanish has two different states of being, permanency and temporary. We don't have it. So this is like the people-centered language does us the favor of the temporary state of being.
No, I love that. Really thoughtful changes. Any other substantive recommendations for the framework?
I think it's good, Zach. I think it does. I mean, it touches on those or makes it possible for us to prioritize, analyze, and reflect within this, so we can use it to do that.
I certainly think so. I do want to just elevate to open space. Like, are we so that these three things are worthy areas of focus? This is not to say they're the only areas of focus. It's not to say that other areas are not important, but are we brought in that these are worthy areas of our equity framework focus?
So can I get in, Zach?
Yeah, go for it. Jump in.
So I am a big fan, as I said, I'm a really big fan of the initial statement because I think it's very clear about what our goals are, and it's a very useful device, I think, for sort of sifting all of our policy proposals through. And I like the way you have this idea of then we'll have 4 or 5 questions attached to that will help us use that framework or that statement. I am not thrilled with this section or the next section. And the reason is that these priorities, these make a lot of sense to us right now. And I want to talk about them, but I don't know that it makes a lot of sense to put in something that we think of as permanent, our priorities, because our priorities are going to shift. So when you say, well, are these some of our priorities? Are they all of our priorities? Well, why have that conversation now? We should have that conversation as we're taking up what our priorities are going to be. And I just worry that we create all of this. You say you don't want it to be bureaucratic. I worry about that. I worry that it's very Baroque. I worry that we spend a lot of time on the language and we take away our power to focus on things that we want to focus on when we want to focus on. And let me just give you a couple of examples on this. So on the academic outcomes, I think we're all for that. We're for it anyway. I don't really think it's all that useful to be here talking about, well, does it mean academic or does it also mean high school graduation? It's all right though, whatever. We're always going to be largely about these outcomes. So, okay. The second one, the student educator community and human capital representation. On the one hand, I certainly think that it's always important. So I don't want to trivialize it as a goal. But I want to say the reason we're so focused on it right now is because in our particular moment, in our particular system, it was the most important thing to take up with regard, frankly, to academic outcomes. We chose that priority, and we have done a lot on that priority, and we have built it out because we found efficacy in it, and we found coalition partners around it. To me, that's the way these priorities and these projects should grow. Not to put it here and say forever that is our priority. And I would say, going down to the third one, the same thing, and not at all to be dismissive of this particular focus area being super important. And in fact, I think we'll get to it in any case because we're working on social studies. But I think you could come up with, at a given moment, there could be other professional development things that you say are the most important to do now, that this is what we're going to have a whole project around. And again, it's not to minimize the focus area, which I think is referred to anyway up front, or it could be. The point is, I think getting this particular in what we should be focused on, I feel like it engages us in a lot of discussion that ends up being very abstract. What word, what this, is it high school graduation or isn't? When what we should be doing is figuring out what are we going to focus on. So that's, and I will probably say something similar when we get to the next section, but I want to end by saying, and I love the first part and I love the question, so.
Totally. I want to open that up for board reaction. If I could just offer a response for people to digest and then respond to, I would say the equity statement intentionally is broad. It's more macro. This equity framework is distilled into 3 focus areas. Secondly, I would say, again, I would reiterate, our status quo is not working. And so to the question of why focus here, I would argue because our at-risk student groups are not excelling. They've been lagging for many years, despite many investments. We know that there is a lack of representation across many different groups, not just racial, in our schools. And research is very clear of the benefit of students seeing representation and affirming representation. And we know as recent as this year, with all what's going on, equity-based conversations is what I'll frame it as, is important. Thirdly, I would say, while this is the hope is for this to be an institutional framework, you will notice in the proposed bylaws changes, there is room to come back and tweak and adjust. And so I would say, if we ever get to a point and at-risk student groups are far excelling white students, for instance, yeah, by all means, let's focus on it. But I just, that's not what's happening, and that's not what's been happening. And so there is room to adjust it. And then the fourth thing I would just say, we're spending a lot of time here dissecting words and structures, orientation, because we're in the design phase. Our focus on this framework would not live there as we're executing on it once we vote on it. I think now is the time to parse words and structure versus later. So just wanted to offer those words And just end on, it's not to say that these three things are the only things that matter, but as a board, we're putting a stake in the ground to say they matter to us and therefore we should focus on it. So I would love to open it up to the board to react to anything you just heard.
We're talking about equity, right? And I think that this does focus on equity. And that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the other stuff. We're talking about equity in education. And I think all three of these things are very important. If we elaborate on it, or if another board, when Alex is the president of the State Board of Education, if that board has something that's much more current, then they can add to that. But this covers exactly what we've been talking about and what wasn't working and what we want to work. So I think it fits really well.
One quick thing is all of those points are in the statement. I just want to be clear about that. It's not to suggest those points aren't in the statement. They are in the statement. It's about playing them out in that kind of detailed way. Sorry, Jessica. That's it.
Yeah, so I'll just say this. I think part of my day job is helping organizations craft strategic frameworks and strategic plans. And usually the problem in any strategy for an organization is in narrowing their focus to do a fewer number of things well. And it's hard, right? Because we all feel pulled to respond to the moment, to respond to the thing. And we do want to leave some bandwidth in any organization to respond to the urgent things of the moment. But we want also to ask organizations to focus their lens on what's at the core of their mission. What are they really trying to accomplish, and what will they hold themselves accountable for? And to me, the equity framework 3 pieces that Zachary's laid out here, I think resonate with me as the kind of things that are present in the kind of board I want to be a part of, and what I hope a board representing DC students would sort of keep their eyes on the prize for every day. Because we know that there are some students, going back to our earlier conversation about reopening in various ways families are arranging care. We know there are some children who are going to come out of this pandemic experience having had consistency in care, even as we have all suffered from various effects of the pandemic, and others who are so disadvantaged by racism, societal frameworks, lack of housing, lack of access to good nutrition, that are going to feel these effects much more acutely. And if I think about who we should be working for, my effort's going to go to those kids all the time. And so this framework will help ensure that our board keeps our eyes on that. I think for the representation piece and the focus on anti-racism, it certainly resonates with the pieces that we're pushing for in the social studies standards. And so it helps me think, like, is our work with the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee on track to do those things? So for me, I see this as a way for us to check, is the current work we're doing aligned with what we care about? And is any new work we add that is not emergency, is any new work we add aligned with this? It doesn't mean we should ignore emergencies. Obviously, we have to. But it also means that as we pay attention to emergencies, we should focus to make sure that even in those emergent situations, can we attend to these things? And if we can, forefront those, even as we watch the rest of the emergency. So I like this because it confirms a lot of my priors and aligns with my worldview on how I like to organize organizations I work with. So I don't think it excludes things so much as it forces us to be conscious of the choices we make to put through this filter. And if it doesn't neatly fit through the filter, right? If we're like Cinderella's stepsisters jamming their foot into the glass slipper, then is this really an issue we should take on with our bandwidth now? Or is there something else we probably should pay attention to? So that's my 2 cents.
Hey guys, it's Ashley. Something I had similar concerns that Ruth posed under the representation portion of the guidance. I would consider, instead of using historically marginalized groups, changing that to make it broader and change that to just diverse groups. because don't talk, because when you using historically marginalized groups, it pigeonholes us and doesn't make us think about things like religion, age, socioeconomic status, political affiliation. Those are all issues that are encompassed using the word diverse, whereas historically they may not necessarily be historically marginalized. Zachary, you're muted. Still muted. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. No, I was just saying thank you for that. Are there other thoughts?
I have, well, this was kind of adding on to what Jessica was saying, but I sort of see the equity framework playing out, and I'll use an analogy to describe it. So in debate, there's like a topicality argument. For example, in the summer camp I was in, the entire theme is basically criminal justice reform. And so one of the questions was like, okay, is this education reform or criminal justice reform? In the sense, like, if you lose that argument, you lose the entire debate. So I feel like when we're advocating for policy, when we're voting on policy, I could see this being like, in a sense, okay, is this piece of legislation equitable? Because if it's not, then is that something that we should be pushing? So I feel like I see it in a way as like, okay, like it's sort of like a checkbox kind of thing on anything that the state board does. And if it's not equitable, then what can we do to make it equitable? So I just see it being in that sense of, okay, anything and everything we do as a state board should meet these guidelines in a sense.
Thank you for that.
I just want to say, all of the points, all of the priorities, they're all in the equity statement. My issue is just with the increasing detail that goes on. So the equity statement is very clear about the issues generally and has the three focuses on the improving the outcomes, advocating for increased representation of historically marginalized, increasing access to culturally relevant. It's this next part where it goes more into detail, and then in the next part more into detail. So that's, I just want to be clear. I'm not objecting to making these a filter. That's sort of what I said up front. It's really the detail of it. So that's the last I'll say on that.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm going to move us ahead. What I will commit to doing is touching base either in groups, committees, or one-on-one with you all after tonight's meeting to just run through edits and the like. One thing I would just say, last thing on here, in terms of being overly prescriptive, I think within each of these categories, they're broad enough that one leadership board or 1 year, the board as a whole could take up different angles. So for representation, 1 year, maybe it's focused on women. Another year, maybe representation is focused on race. Another year, maybe it's focused on various backgrounds or socioeconomic levels. Same for outcomes. I think there are a lot of characteristics under the definition of at risk, if we do in fact go with that, or those who are considered at risk, to Jessica's definition, which I like better. I think you could look at homeless students 1 year. You could think about students with disabilities, a certain class. I think there are different angles you can look at each of these categories. So just throwing that out there for more for you to think about. I am not going to focus in depth on the definitions. I would just recommend these for you to go and just offer suggestions. You can highlight, offer comments in the document. I do not think these are perfect by any means. They were truly a draft. But I do think, per our conversation tonight, it's going to be important that we are fully clear what we mean by these key terms. And so that would be a next step. The other thing, and I'm going to stop sharing. Let's see if I could do this. I just wanted to end on, I don't know how to, John Paul, how do I stop sharing my screen?
Should be at the top of your screen, a little orange button.
Okay. While we do that,
Zach, I just want to say, I did think you were ending because we do have to move on. So,
well, the only other thing I wanted to discuss were the proposed bylaw changes, to give people an opportunity to speak on that.
Yeah, I actually have a question about that. Considering that bylaws are contract and, the whole meaning of bylaws, they shouldn't be amended frequently. And the fact that we spend overhaul of each year in January, and we just did an overhaul this past January, I would consider the fact that it's by the time these even get passed, it'll be October before they even go into effect. And the fact that it's an election year, people, there will be new members on the board. I would consider moving the bylaws changes to the new board in January when they do an overhaul as per normal.
Okay. Thank you for that. I would just say the bylaw changes are solely connected to the equity framework. And so putting in language around monitoring the work, reflecting with the framework, et cetera. And so, yeah.
Can you go into detail? Because some of it seems to be equity related, and then there is the insert of the censure rules that were just put in. And for those doing their due diligence, those censure rules were inserted in 2017, and there was a very large working group meeting, a long conversation specifically related to those censure rules. And so I wanted to get feedback specifically on that, because there were certain members on the board now who actually didn't want those rules in at that time.
Yeah, and I think those members, i.e. Ruth, may still object to them in full disclosure. I would say, yeah, the censure language is connected to the equity framework in terms of our ability as a board to address members that may not live up to the ethics or behavior, if you will, of the board. It is.
So, Zachary, I want to.
If I could just finish my thought.
Go ahead.
The bulk of the changes are around monitoring, reflecting, using the equity framework, adding in language around the equity framework. The central language is the central language that was once in the state board's bylaws that was struck down. And so that language, if I'm not mistaken, largely mirrors, if not identically, the council's language around censure.
Yeah, I thought they were approved and then struck down this past January, correct?
Yes. So it was a move to put them back in.
Right. I understand. I do want to clarify, because it's not around behavior. The procedures stem from former board members having instances of misappropriation of funds, and that these censure procedures specifically are around ethical violations, and there is specific language in the rules that allow for freedom of speech, and that censoring anyone's speech, even if you believe it to be problematic, cannot be enforced for censure.
Yes, I am fully aware of that. I actually take issue with that language, but John Paul has reminded me that is the law, so I will defer to the law. I will be transparent, and I would love for others to jump in. I am not wedded to the censure language. I just thought it was relevant and connected to the equity framework. And so I know Ruth has taken issue with putting it back in. I think as a board, for us to not have any recourse or statement of recourse in our bylaws is curious. Obviously, we can't expel members from the board for doing any wrongdoing. And as it stands right now, we can't even censure them. for doing wrong because we don't have a censure policy. So I would just leave it there.
So I just want to, make sure that if we do put these in, I would like to note that there are actual ethical violations potentially pending for board members. Several, as elected officials, we have a duty to file our financial disclosures. We've had many conversations over the past 2 years, especially this past year, about board members and their conflict of interests. And it is a serious offense for non-filing, which includes, and we've all been trained with our BIGA manuals. So I would highly suggest to members that they think about, before they adding this censure language. I, for one, actually voted for the language into the bylaws the first time. But I would like to that end, I would like to submit for the record that the following board members have failed to file their financial disclosure for this year, even after given both an extension and reminders. Marcus Batchelor, Zachary Parker, Jessica Sutter, Fraser O'Leary, and Emily Gasoy. I also want to note that all members did receive BIGA training, and that ignorance is not a defense.
Ashley,
May I please speak?
Yes, go for it.
So I was contacted by a constituent this week about an alleged failure to file, and I called BEGA to ensure that my receipt of filing was accurate. I was informed that there is a data glitch. If you search under role for SBOE member, only 3 members of the board appear as having filed. Those members are Ruth Wattenberg, Ashley McClay, and Karen Williams. If instead you do not search using that feature, and instead search using the agency, SBOE, you will find many more of our colleagues have filed, including Mr. Parker, Dr. Gasoy, and myself.
Well said. I just would say the censure language was not a gotcha. I do not think it's worth an extended debate. I'm happy to hear further debate on it. But if members are objecting to the language around the censure, it literally was the language that was there before. I think we could,
I voted for it.
I think we could still propose changes to the bylaws that anchor around the framework and leave that out.
The one thing I would just say is how easily censure can be used against people, as we just saw, based on whatever personal reasons people have. And that's what I worry about. It's part of how it got in there in the first place. And I just think that this is not the way and the place to do that, and putting in the censure language kind of motivates that. But we have ways to deal with these issues. That's my only point. But yeah.
Okay, I know time is ticking. Are there any other substantive concerns around the bylaw recommendations? Okay, seeing and hearing nothing, we will continue to talk. Just to remind you of the process, we will talk about this over the next month. We will bring finalized revisions, or I should say finalized proposals to the September working session. In addition to what you've already seen, there will be a formal resolution around this. There will also be those guidance documents that I'm going to ask you all to help me create. So Dr. Sutter, Dr. O'Leary, Dr. Gasoy, and others, just like what are those guiding questions we should be thinking about, as well as the actual language that we've discussed already. So, and then we would vote in our September public meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. All right, we're up to committee reports. We are behind schedule, so insofar as you don't need to give a long one, don't. Insofar as you do. We have done well-rounded, so I'm going to go in order here and start with Fraser with teacher retention.
I'm trying to get something off my screen here. Oh, I got on. I can't. I don't know what's happened. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because I have a strange thing on my screen. I don't know how to get it off. But so what teacher retention right now, we had a wonderful presentation by the staff at the DC Data Summit. It went very well. There weren't that many people in the room or the virtual room, but it was a great presentation about we got to show the video and we got to talk about the teacher retention, what the teacher retention committee has done. Right now we're working on trying to find out what has happened with the teachers at the end of the school year in 2020. And we've asked for information from DCPS and Aussie. We haven't heard anything back yet. We're going to keep pressing to try to find out what's going to happen. I'm really looking forward to finding out what how many teachers are going to be out of the system when school opens in September. And so that's where we are right now. Do you have any questions? Did you hear me? Okay.
No questions, but I just wanted to publicly thank you for your work on the committee, Representative O'Leary. There have been a lot of conversations I've heard from community members, educators, or even our deputy mayor. And so I think the work around teacher retention is still percolating. And I think that's in large part because you've been keeping it alive. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And
it's not me.
I was struggling to reach my mute button so I could say something similar, Fraser. And thanks for all of you and the staff who's listening to do the presentation and bring this stuff more broadly.
Yeah, I watched the panel at the DC Data Summit, and that was really good, Fraser.
Great, thank you.
Okay, social studies, Jessica.
Thank you. So a couple exciting things. Since we last had a working session, we had our first Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee meeting with all 26 of our fabulous members, thanks to the hard work of this board to help us select them. The meetings, just for everyone's reminder, are the second Tuesday of the month from 5 to 7 p.m. So we held our first meeting on July the 7th. It was a wonderful meeting, and folks spent most of the meeting getting oriented to one another who was in the group, what our charge is as a committee, and then talking through some of the reasons that they decided to participate and what their thinking is around the problems with the current standards and the opportunities that we have. After that first meeting, we also had a wonderful story in the 74 about the social studies standards revision process. I was happy to talk with the reporter, but we also had wonderful interviews with a number of members of the committee. So I know Malayo had sent that out, and it was on our CISAC Google group. So if you haven't seen it, I'm happy to share it again. It's a great piece of coverage for our board and our work, and for the great members we have on our committee. The State Board of Education Social Studies Committee is going to keep meeting the Wednesday morning after the CISAC meeting. So each second Tuesday of the month, we'll have the CISAC meeting, and then the Wednesday morning following, we'll reconvene with the board committee to get a report out on what happened and start planning for the next meeting. So next meeting of this advisory committee is next Tuesday, August 11th, from 5 to 7 p.m. It'll be live streamed on our YouTube channel. We're going to be using Zoom, which I'm really excited about, because it will allow us to break off into breakout groups, which will allow our members to get to know each other more and really have their voices and insights heard in a way that's a little bit harder in a whole group. And I really am appreciative of our staff for figuring out how to make that work with the live stream and security and all the pieces that go into that. Because I think it will be a game changer for engagement, but also a nice opportunity given that these meetings are likely to remain virtual throughout the life of this committee, to really spend more time together. I'll just share that our meeting next Tuesday has 2 focus points. One is our final product. This committee is charged with creating guiding principles to bring back to the state board for our consideration, and then for our approval and transmission to Aussie, so that Aussie can convene a technical writing committee to write or revise standards that align with those guiding principles. We need to do a little boundary setting and level setting with the committee to make sure folks know what constitutes a guiding principle and what doesn't, so that we are all understanding the product we're creating. We're also going to get people's feedback on the current social studies standards. Their homework from the last meeting was to read the standards in full and answer 5 reflection questions. And we'll examine people's input on that and start to generate some guiding principle examples from their feedback. So pretty excited about it. Delighted to have any of you observe the meeting as you're able to. Really glad that Alex is on our committee and can provide a second voice on the work to the committee. He and I had a great one-on-one chat today. Karen Williams, my co-chair, and I are reaching out to all of or co-facilitator, are reaching out to all 26 members to have one-on-one conversations and start to build some more relationship with them. So we've had great talks about what people hope for from the process, what's going well, and what folks want to see changed. Happy to answer any questions, but that's the latest from social studies.
I have a question, Jessica or Alex. Has there been any talk about not doing a traditional syllabus for history? I mean,
Meaning like a not chronological history arrangement?
Well, that's how I feel about it, but also not necessarily, but just that I know that a lot of teachers don't get to the mid 20th century and beyond when they're teaching U.S. history. And I think that's a crime.
I'm going to let Alex respond first.
Yeah, Jessica and I, when we called earlier today, we were actually talking about learning thematically and looking at non-traditional ways of learning history, and also ways to make sure that we're understanding things, for example, that happen in America and in the global context of what's happening in the world, and also just making sure that she even told me a story about a Canadian reporter talking about how she learned history and the way like the grade level when she learned about like government, and then when she learned about history, then like they went more in depth. So we're definitely looking at ways to make it easier for students to understand what's happening without necessarily being like, oh, so in the 1910s and the 1920s, just different ways, non-traditional ways from what we've learned in the past.
So Fraser, I'll say that in that first conversation, that your point is exactly where a lot of folks spent their time discussing. There was a lot of question around, are there better ways to help students see connections across history? Are there better ways to help students make connections between US history and world history? Are there better ways to help students understand geography in the context of all of that? Are there better ways to help students understand principles of government and civics amidst all of that? And in our conversations, my one-on-one conversations with folks, I think that that's a key tension that's emerging is chronology is how we usually organize things. A lot of curricula and pedagogical approaches use themes. What's the right way to land our standards? So for instance, AP is using more big themes. IB does more big themes. What's the right way to approach our standards? We have not reached any conclusion on that, but that was a big piece of feedback we heard from folks in the room. And we'll continue, I'm sure, to debate and discuss as we go through the meetings.
No, that's great. I just, as someone who went to graduated high school in 1962 and in Virginia, and the history books had 2 African Americans in the whole book. That was Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. is that the crime, and it was never taught. There were things that were never taught about history that should have been taught. And this year has blossomed with statues being torn down rightfully. And I think there's nothing wrong with going backwards and finding out what the mistakes were and trying to cure the ills. It's a political statement.
Ruth, I'll just say one more thing because I think I mentioned it earlier. Dr. Carr from Howard University, who testified to the council about the African American History and Cultural Studies Act, made a really important point that I've been wrestling with since that hearing, which is there are times we talk about how to cover things throughout the curriculum so that we don't just talk about them once and leave them be. And oftentimes when we say that, we neglect to actually talk about them throughout the curriculum. So we say we're going to weave it throughout, but failing to give it a home means that it never gets taught in a way that is comprehensive. He mentioned that on Friday, and then one of our CISAC members who studies civics internationally, Lizzie Warden from American University, brought that up again with me. This notion of if things don't have a home in the standards or curriculum, in addition to an effort to weave them through, we may in fact lose the thing we're trying to say repeatedly. So I don't have an opinion on it yet. The committee doesn't have an opinion on it yet. I just want to call those out because it's something that I'm wrestling with in the feedback I've heard and from two professors who brought it up.
Great.
So before moving on, I'll comment on that last piece. I mean, one of the ideas in sort of history education that I think has a lot of power, which is a little bit in between the idea of themes and the idea of you don't know, you're just sort of endlessly going through a list, is the term I've heard is post-holing, which is where you established up front, here are the 4 or 5 or 8 things that you're really going to be following. And in every era, in every discussion, you're coming back to it, much like our equity framework. And that's a way to both be sequential and historical, which I think to me is fundamentally why history is not something else, but it also lets you really do seriously what everybody's saying, which is you want people to be able to grasp particular things and really understand them, not necessarily 1,000 other things. So
yeah, I hadn't heard that term, so I like that. Thank you.
Okay. I may even be able to find something about it, and if so, I will pass it on. Okay. I'm next with research, and I'm really going to try to bring this in on time, so I'm going to be very quick. And I don't have a lot to say because we had a conversation here at this board in June. We then we took those ideas and other discussions we've been having to the committee meeting in June. We sort of wrestled through particular parts of a draft. Members are still working through particular parts of a draft. And we come back together on, I'm sorry, a notification just popped up in front of Jessica's face, so I had to move. No, this is my computer. Anyway, so we'll come back to that at the next meeting. So we'll, try to resolve on sort of a draft that, works reasonably well for everybody that we could bring to a September meeting. That's one goal, because that would then also give us time to sort of talk about it in our communities and still vote on it later. So that's sort of one thing. We got to see how that comes together. And the other thing is we did get some funding from the council to pursue some research projects. So we'll want to talk about that as well. And so we will report back to you later about all that. Any questions before I go on to John Paul or to Marcus for administration? All right, Marcus, John Paul, who wants to?
I can talk a little bit about.
There may be nothing to report, which would be just totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, we have an admin committee meeting tomorrow, and so there'll probably be more to report out after that. But I want to thank the admin committee for their inputs on the budget and other things as well. So that's the only thing I have.
Yeah, appreciate that. I didn't have too much. I was just going to say, John Paul, if you had anything, but I figured we would have updates coming out of our meeting tomorrow.
Okay, new business, anybody? Well, then in that case, with 4 minutes to go, I will accept a motion for adjournment.
A motion to adjourn.
Second? Okay.
Second.
Bye, everybody, until about 1,000 meetings next week. Have a good weekend.
See you guys.
And bye to the audience. Bye, DC.